My guest today is Sean Monahan. He's a trend forecaster and writer based in Los Angeles, one of the founders of K-Hole, which was a legendary New York-based trend forecasting group, most famous for introducing the word normcore to the world, which later went totally viral across the internet and the fashion media. I even read this recently. It was voted neologism of the year by Oxford Press in like 2017. Is this true?
2014.
24. Oh, I got my years wrong. Of
But
course,
we
yeah, I
were
should have mentioned
we
earlier.
we lost no, we lost to Vape and we tied with Bay. But we were in we made it to the finals.
Amazing. You lost to vape. That's
We
interesting.
lost to Vape was the Oxford English Dictionary word of the year in 2014.
Yeah, well, that makes sense too. That was definitely the year that that was
I
going.
I have to
Yeah.
say Vape is probably a much more ubiquitous and commonly used word in day-to-day life than normcore, so maybe they deserve to win.
Yeah, I mean, vape is pretty ubiquitous, as you said, but normcore was no
Yeah.
slouch. My own personal, not that it's that interesting of a story, but it is, now that I know you, it's kind of funny to know you and know that you're the person who coined this term. I mean, I was late to the game on normcore. I wasn't living in New York. I was in college and like, paying more attention to book learning than what was going on in terms of trends. But I definitely remember the moment I learned the word normcore, just me and my girlfriend at the time were in a cafe and we were just talking about this girl we knew, and my ex girlfriend was talking about her sense of style, and she's like, "Well, it's very normcore," and I was like, "What the hell is that?" And went down the rabbit hole. That was probably 2015, so I was like 2 years late to the party. But nevertheless, that's I guess that's how long it took for it to reach even someone who wasn't paying attention was just a couple years, and
Yeah, no, I mean
yeah,
I have this funny memory actually, and maybe I believe it was 2018.
yeah,
I was doing some work in Atlanta, and I must have met like three or four people who like brought up normcore to me just organically while I was there,
yeah.
which I found really odd because by 2018, I don't know, people weren't really talking about it that much in New York anymore. It was kind of a fait accompli there at that point.
Yeah, and
But
yeah, yeah.
I met this one guy there who was a buyer for Kohl's,
Hmm.
the department
Right.
store.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Yeah, normcore, it's all the rage for the Kohl's."
Yeah, well, that's I guess
And I
how
was like,
fashion always works, right? Like it trickles down literally over the
yeah, I
course
mean,
of yeah.
this is kind of one of my more, I guess, unpopular opinions.
Hmm.
Is that it's true that like information moves really fast online these days, but I don't actually think culture changes at the speed of information.
Yeah, no,
It
true, true,
still
true.
takes
Yeah.
about 5 years, I think, for things to really fully saturate a big market like the US.
I think it makes sense because people, while our digestion of information has skyrocketed in terms of rate, the rate at which people actually buy clothes and make sort of fashion decisions and like personal branding decisions
Yeah.
has not necessarily sped up because the budgets for getting
Well,
new clothes, et cetera, remain the same, and most people don't really want to be that on the beat.
most people don't care that
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
I mean, I like the biggest kind of like vertical for clothing in the US is workwear. Most people are
Yeah,
buying clothes because they want to look nice at work, and work is where they spend the majority of their time. And they're not like really trying to be that fashionable per se.
yeah.
I
Which
think
lends itself to something
doing
like
kind of like
Normcore, but yeah,
doing like ethnographic research or focus groups with kind of just more normal middle class people is interesting to me in that way sometimes because you realize like there's like all these kind of normie mommy influencers.
yeah,
And they'll work for like JC Penney's or Kohl's or Target or something. And most of the content is just like, oh, here's some stuff that's like for sale within your budget. That's,
hmm,
they're talking to people who are not buying luxury goods. And this is how you could put it together and look nice. And people really, really like this kind of content because, I don't know. I went to art school. I know a lot of
hmm,
people in the fashion industry. These are the people that think culture is moving faster than ever, but they're kind of a self-selected avant-garde that's
yeah.
interested in fashion per se, and also are very creative and have really good taste.
Hmm.
And this, I'm not trying to be condescending to like, mass market consumers, but when you surround yourself with, artists,
Yeah,
it can be easy to forget that not everyone's an artist, and some
definitely.
people want help with, how they should dress themselves. I mean, this
Yeah.
is kind of, I think, why Derek Guy, do you follow him on Twitter?
No, should I? Yeah.
He's like the menswear. For some reason, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, his content just started getting fed to lots and lots of people.
Hmm.
And his POV is he's just like a very like traditional menswear guy. Like he
Yeah.
knows how things should fit and how they should be put together. And traditional menswear is really a rabbit hole that you can go down, like varieties of cuts and fabrics
Yeah.
and different style influences and yada yada yada. And I think half of his content is him like looking at, I don't know, even just like a lot of politicians. Or he also like makes fun of like, I don't know, people like Jordan Peterson, who just they're wearing really weird things together. It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
And like a point that he brings up periodically is that like historically, people talk about like why does everyone look like shit today? You know,
Yeah.
and a lot of it has to do with the fact that in the past, people just had much narrower choices and also kind of didn't presume that they knew how to dress themselves best. So they would go to a place like a Brooks Brothers, or maybe
They'd
something
actually
like,
consult
or
with a
maybe something more
shopkeeper.
affordable
Yeah.
even. But the people who worked there would know about clothing and be able to tell you kind of like how to put things
Yeah.
together. And
That's a
and
lost
that was
art.
kind of more
Yeah.
part of their job. And now I think we've leaned so far into like fashion as a personal expression vehicle that you know I think there's a lot of people who just don't know, they don't know what to wear,
They just opt out, sort of. And,
well, and then the worst version of that is someone like, I don't know, like John Fetterman, like
yeah, no, that's a
like
great
voting
example.
voting in the Senate in like basketball shorts and a hoodie, which I think is
Terrible.
terrible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
No,
just
people,
I just don't think like there's a certain level of casualness that just like, I don't know, you start to imagine like the Senate in 2060 with like people with like unwashed hair and like snuggies voting on bills.
no, I
It
do
just
think a
seems
lot of
so
people
unserious.
sort of opt out. And I mean, people make fun of Jordan Peterson for wearing like cargo shorts or whatever. But I mean, I think you get on both sides of the political aisle. But to continue with the intro just a little bit, we talked about
Yeah.
normcore, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. But more recently, you went viral again. This was last year for popularizing the term vibe shift to describe the current cultural flux emerging out of the pandemic. We can get more into that later, but just to stay a little bit in
Yep.
intro mode, you now do, just for listeners, you now do your trend forecasting on Substack through a report called 8 Ball. You're also a
Uh-huh.
regular contributor to the Guardian, and you work as a freelance PR and branding consultant, correct?
Pretty much.
Yeah,
I don't know if I would always say PR, but yeah, I mean,
yeah, yeah.
branding bleeds into PR. It's kind of like a focus thing.
Hmm.
I would
Gotcha.
say
Yeah,
I'm not as much of a publicist because um I don't know as many people in the press as my publicist friends do.
yeah. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I realize that is a somewhat different sphere than branding, even if it's kind of a similar skill
It's
set.
yeah, I mean, we live in an era where I think a lot of different roles have gotten really fuzzy.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of that just has to do with the internet
Yeah,
kind of making it more ambiguous
yeah. I mean,
what someone's role is in relationship to something.
because traditionally branding would be for a product, and public relations is a much bigger concept that could be for an
Well,
individual or an organization. But the difference
yeah,
between products
public
and
relations is
individuals, yeah,
tends to be, you hire someone who has a relationship with the press, who understands who the different editors are, who the
yeah.
different writers are, what their POVs are, and then they're usually working off somewhat of like a brand POV
Hmm.
because the branding is supposed to establish like the high level architecture for like what this company is and how it appears in the world, and then PR might be like a more specific outcome. But I've met some interesting publicists too who like have kind of a more modern perspective. I'm trying to remember the agency, but I met someone who worked for Walmart once,
Hmm.
and their POV was, I don't know, I forget the figure that they threw at us, which I found kind of shocking and impressive. But it was like 70% of Americans have like been in a Walmart in the past week.
Yeah.
So that's really where the PR starts for them and the branding starts for them, because it's not that they're worried about what people know about them in this like meta sense, which
Yeah.
for most brands is true. But if you're like a really huge one like Walmart, it's more about like, well, how are people experiencing the Walmart that they go into? That's going to be the
Yeah.
primary driver of their,
It has to
opinion.
do with narrative creation on a somewhat broader level.
Yeah,
Or
because I mean,
like,
a lot
yeah.
of even with branding, it depends on the scale of of the company, and then also how old they are and how well known they are. So, for younger brands, they're going to be really concerned with achieving higher levels of name recognition and establishing what kind of a company they are and establishing a tone and familiarizing people with their products and the specific claims around them. And if you're a bigger, older brand, it might be more like reputational, because
Yeah.
everyone knows what your product is, but you might be more concerned with them. I mean, the Bud Light thing is a good example of
Yeah.
how a big, huge brand, best-selling beer in America, can create a public relations fiasco for themselves.
Yeah, by not
Um,
understanding their own client
but
base.
yeah, well, I my POV on that even is like, I think that the Bud Light stuff starts a lot more with the video that leaked of the
Yeah.
head of the brand, Alyssa Heinerschneid, I think was her name,
Hmm.
kind of denigrating their core consumer demo, which
Yeah.
is like, I mean, I'm not like sharing some deep insight here. It's pretty obvious. Don't insult the people, the biggest
Yeah.
demo of people that buy your product. And I think actually it has a lot more to do with that ultimately than the Dylan Mulvaney stuff.
Yeah, no, because once the cards, people could forgive a brand a misstep in terms of branding, but when the cards are on the table, like this is actually how we feel about our client base, and we're doing this branding in order to give them the middle finger, then there's not a lot of room
I mean,
for
there's
alternative.
something
Yeah,
funny about it too, in that, I think it speaks actually to the role of TikTok, which I don't know.
yeah,
TikTok increasingly seems to be where like a lot of the weird, crazy shit happens in the way that it used to be Twitter.
yeah,
And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the TikTok algorithm is very good at exposing people to things that they're not necessarily following, right?
yes, yes,
Um, so like for example, like I mean, Bud Light has been doing stuff for Pride for forever. Like, I mean,
yeah,
I'm
right.
I'm gay.
All
I go
companies,
to gay
yeah,
bars.
yeah,
They have a lot of rainbow merch. It's been that way for a really long time, probably since the '90s.
yeah, yeah,
But the reason why, and I'm not going to accuse all of their core consumers of like not liking the Pride stuff or whatever. Who knows? But I think just the average Bud Light consumer probably doesn't go to as many gay bars as I do, so probably just didn't even notice. You know,
right, yeah,
like there was a way in which you could kind of more micro target your brand output to different audiences. Because
mhm,
even a lot of these beer brands, maybe their actual audience is like a little bit more politically ambivalent, but maybe the distributors tend to be red state Republicans, so
yeah,
they'll make like secret ads for that group of people that they don't show more broadly. That's like I don't know, like brand labels on like fighter jets and stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um but it's harder to do that with TikTok and Twitter, because now the
Mhm.
micro targeted stuff that's for a specific audience kind of like ends
It's
up finding its
unavoidable.
way
Yeah.
towards the audience that it's not meant for. And then maybe the audience feels betrayed or confused or
Yeah.
angry or just off put. So I think that probably some of these questions are gonna keep cropping up, because I think
Hmm.
that the TikTok for you algorithm and the Twitter for you algorithm serve up, the rage bait.
Yeah,
To
no,
keep people,
absolutely.
like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of in some ways, it's funny to me, because I think modern advertising is deeply concerned with the internet, but still struggles. I think to kind of like ride the dragon,
Yeah.
partially because it's in the interest of the algorithms and the platforms to cultivate like these negative emotions, because that keeps people
Keeps
engaged,
people engaged. Interesting.
which is I mean, it's kind of funny, but yeah, I don't know. I think we're going to be having more conversations in the future about the extent to which you can ever be brand safe on the internet. But it's not
Yeah.
always bad. Like, I mean, I think the Grimace milkshake TikTok trend is
Yes.
really funny.
Yeah, no, I may even get in on that, like, which is ridiculous. Like, why would I go to McDonald's? But it's like it's so funny to me that I almost want to see what it's about. But there you have like just yeah, a total. I mean, I don't know if someone at McDonald's started the Grimace thing
I
or
don't
what,
think
but
they
like
did.
I don't think they did either. I think it's organic, but man, they must be making sales off of it just because it's
Oh,
like yeah,
I'm sure it puts them in a really weird position in that it's probably great for the brand. It's funny, but it's funny in a way that like brands don't give themselves the leash to be funny,
yeah,
you
no,
know?
yeah,
And but also maybe if they did do it, it would have
not been
upset
funny.
some people, right?
Yeah,
Like
right,
it
yeah.
might have upset some parents if McDonald's was like promoting the idea that Grimace is like a murderer,
Yeah,
or
no, it
like
probably would have,
an
or
evil ghost that kills you when you drink his milkshake.
yeah, and and
Um,
and I feel like if they'd endorsed it too much, like it wouldn't be cool or funny anymore. Like people would be like, I'm not just gonna like do McDonald's thing. But
yeah,
when it feels like it's this online troll, it's a lot of fun. So
yeah.
it's this, yeah. There's aren't I don't know. I feel like every few years there's like a good example like this with the Grimace Shake where it's like just a total, brand a very good branding moment for a company that like didn't have to do anything for it because their product gets
Well,
memed in that way. Yeah.
the reason I think they didn't start it is because there's such strict rules
Yeah.
from the FCC around advertising that you're not really legally allowed to do a psyop like that and not say that you did it yourself.
Yeah. Unless there's
That's
some
why I
some high
presume.
level behind the scenes shit. But honestly, I think it's as likely that it's just
I
yeah.
just can't imagine a reality in which someone at McDonald's would sign off on a campaign like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because McDonald's
Like
is
it's
probably you may know what I mean, but they've got to be a somewhat more conservative company with regard to this kind of stuff, given their size.
well, but I mean, all brands are somewhat conservative, especially if part of your audience is kids, right?
Yeah.
Um, because you have to deal with parents, and it's a little trickier.
Definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they would be worried about legal repercussions, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I saw a really crazy one where someone hung themselves with chains off of a bridge.
I hadn't seen
And
that
I'm
one,
like,
but yeah.
yeah. So if they had started the meme, and I don't know, someone else tries to hang themselves off
Yeah,
a
like
bridge,
maybe
chains,
someone's
or
gonna get hurt and
gets
then they'd be
hurt or
liable.
something,
Yeah.
then they might be liable, et cetera, et cetera. So I doubt it, but it is kind of it's what brands want ultimately.
Definitely.
Brands want to become
Memes. Almost, right?
memes,
Yeah.
but it's tricky because I think Bud Light also has become a meme,
Yeah.
and not in a good way, and that's why they
Not in a
lost
good
their
way.
top slot as
Exactly. So
the
it's
most purchased beer in America.
and the
This
difference
has become
between
a
a
meme, but
good or a bad meme could be hard to have total control over,
it's
you
just
know what I
like
mean?
teen
Yeah.
boys fucking around on the internet. It's
Yeah.
it's probably not precisely what McDonald's thinks their brand is, but it's clearly entertaining and driving sales.
Definitely. Um, to focus back on you, like
Mm,
I guess so you're both a trend forecaster, obviously, and you do branding as we discussed. What would you say like the common skill there is in both trend forecasting and doing branding? And I'll preface this a little bit. I liked a quote that you had in one of your, I think, Vibe Shift interviews, or maybe it was one of the Normcore reports or whatever. But you talk about how you studied art at RISD at the Rhode Island School of Design and how that kind of gave you a sense for the sort of cyclical image making culture within the West after modernity. It was a very sort of high-minded thing.
yeah,
It
I
made
think
sense
really,
to me.
really, really pulling out my BFA.
Yeah. No,
No,
totally.
I
Yeah.
went to a really conservative art school,
Mhm.
and I don't think that was a bad thing actually,
You mean
because
conservative, like
they
aesthetically?
really made us
Yeah.
learn in depth. I mean, I've forgotten all of it now. I could probably remind myself, but about the history of modernism, the history of painting, and the way that you see different periods swoop in, and oftentimes those periods are in direct response to what came before.
Yeah, I think you
Like,
even
I
said
mean, I
something
think
like
the
there's
easiest
like
one
a
is to be like,
yeah.
high modernism in the US, color field painting, monochromes, abstraction, and then you go like you shift towards like postmodernism in the 70s and
Yeah.
80s,
Did
and
you
you see like
even
new media work and
in
kitsch.
this exactly? I mean, in this quote of yours, I'm remembering. Did you even perhaps wax Freudian and say there's like a patricidal element
Yes.
where it's yeah. So like that, I tie this in with
Well, I
yeah
think it is. I think most creative movements are patricidal. I mean, certainly
yeah.
that's kind of like what was annoying people about the vibe shift predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because
Because
people,
well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, people felt threatened by it, and indeed, a lot of the pieces you can find on this, the most notable being from New York Magazine. You know, the headline is a vibe shift is coming. Will you survive it? Like it's all written from this like millennial post
yeah.
pandemic
I mean,
getting
I mean,
older and worried about it perspective.
the
Yeah,
original thing that I wrote, a lot of it was about aging, and the way in which because everyone was locked down for I wrote it in June 2021, so it was
right.
right after
Yeah.
everyone was vaccinated and things were reopening, and yeah, we had all been kind of in some version of quarantine, some more than others, for I don't know, a little
Two
over a
years.
year,
Yeah,
almost a year and a half,
yeah.
and uh yeah, I think a lot of millennials were in this kind of like interstitial moment in their
Mm-hmm.
lives, right? Where
Yeah.
they're they're not they're not quite middle aged yet, but they're not really that young yet
They're
either.
not as young as they were going into the pandemic. Crucial.
Yeah, and also, millennials, like I wrote about this in the past about how there was some like kind of funny bait and switch to some extent between talking about hipsters and talking about millennials that happened in the early 2010s,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
because I just don't even remember the word millennial being used very much in the 2000s,
It wasn't.
like
Yeah.
the generational self-awareness hadn't really been codified.
No.
I think in the 2010s we saw just a ton in the early 2010s about millennials, and then the late 2010s about Gen Z, that like gave both sides kind of a coherent generational identity
Yeah,
that
we're
was kind
much
of
more
more,
generationally aware than we used to be. It's interesting.
yeah.
Seemingly. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think people came out and they just realized that they weren't the young people anymore, and there were all these new young people
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
had who were doing different things than they had been doing, or
And mhm,
actively mocking
actively
things.
mocking, reacting against it.
But
Yeah.
I also will say I don't think it's entirely like a us versus them thing. I think
No.
the
No.
generational conflict stuff is kind of, I think, a bit,
It flares
oh,
up
it's
in
overblown
very
for media purposes.
yeah, I think it flares up in very specific instances where it's like, okay, this is a clear battle of the generations. I'm trying to think of a good example, but like certain cultural moments kind of come to that head.
But
But most of us or many of us are like I myself, I'm 28. Like I kind of have aspects of me that are more millennial and aspects that are more Gen Z. Like it's not a clear cut conflict because a lot of us are sort of in between. Like it's a spectrum, right? Of where
yeah,
the vibe shift is a spectrum, like where you stand in relation to it. If you're a millennial or if you're Gen Z, like it can vary pretty widely. Like
well,
yeah, I think yeah,
I think like, but when she talks about surviving it, part of it is that like the original thing I wrote, like I talked about like the idea of like the hype dad.
yeah,
um
like millennial
and
dad,
how
yeah,
at some point it's just a little embarrassing to try to be overly trendy at a certain age.
yeah,
And I mean the word trendy in like the traditional usage of it, like to be chasing trends. Like I don't think it's embarrassing for people to be creative and have personal style, or be sophisticated in their consumer purchases. But it's more so when like all of a sudden, your friend seems like he's really trying to dress like a Zoomer, but he's 35. It's a bit like it's a bit embarrassing.
yeah, yeah.
And the other problem too is that also sometimes people's style just locks in at a certain age.
Yeah, and that's very
part of
natural. But yeah.
part of what I've like written about when I wrote that was this memory I had of moving to New York in 2010 and kind of seeing the aging hipsters start to procreate,
Yes.
like in McCarran Park. So you'd see like the guy with like the sleeve tattoo and the wax mustache, walking his baby in McCarran Park in some like artisanal pram or something.
Hmm.
And I just remember thinking those people look so uncool.
So uncool. Right, right,
But
right.
they had been so cool maybe 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So part of it was also kind of maybe me thinking about mm, I don't know, like the cautionary tales around how to figure out how to dress as an adult. I
Yeah.
don't think we don't really have, and millennials especially, just really have not been on the kind of traditional life
Life
script
path.
path.
Absolutely.
And
And I
then on
think that
top
ties
of
into
it,
it in an interesting way. Yeah.
and this is where the hype dad stuff kind of comes in. We have work cultures now that don't enforce adult dress codes.
Absolutely. And that
So
changed over the pandemic very much. I was wearing a suit to work before the pandemic. Or
yeah,
yeah, or
but
at
even
least
what
business casual. And now I can wear whatever I want, which is
but
a
it's
blessing and a
funny, like
curse. Yeah.
even creative agencies and stuff, or ad agencies, which have always had kind of a much looser dress code because they're creatives, they're
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the time you just see everyone wearing the same things.
Yeah.
You walk around like an office and you see everyone shopping on Urban Outfitters, and there was like this funny moment where they started talking about work twinning. I don't know if you ever heard of this term.
I think I've heard of it, and I think it probably is somewhat
It's
self-explanatory,
when
right?
you
Yeah.
go to work and someone else is wearing the same outfit as you.
I had it happen once or twice. Yeah.
Oh
But no,
no!
it wasn't even a good outfit. It's just like, oh, I have that H&M shirt too.
Well,
Like, I mean, I guess I don't
I
know.
think
That
part of the
probably
problem
shows
is
how
actually that
hopelessly normy I am in my fashion days. But there you
that's
go.
I think it's totally fine. I
Yeah,
think the irony is that and this is like a very millennial problem in some ways, is this presumption that everyone is actually like super unique and special and has all their own ideas and their own fashion and their own personal style. And I think that's not true.
of course
You
not,
know.
right? Yeah, which is kind of what, in theory, jump around a little bit. In theory, that's what normcore was kind of about, embracing that, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
so that's interesting.
it was definitely a reaction against
To
the
to
overwhelming pressure.
snowflakeism, yeah.
Yeah, I well, and also,
Actually, that sounds more like politically conservative. I don't think normcore is like
well, I think
anti-snowflake SJW, but like just anti like a reaction against trying too hard to be individual and instead opting for what connection, right? And the
well, that
ability
was the idea. I mean, I think a lot of it was also just people were burnt out on being hipsters.
to
And the internet had made it like
right.
increasingly impossible to try and find, unique and special things that no one else knew about. Because that was what most like hipster consumerism was all about, like finding the best secret thing, whether it was
Yeah,
like the best secret coffee or the best secret donut
or
or
Animal
the
Collective,
best
like band,
or the
Pitchfork,
best
and yeah,
secret boot brand or the best secret,
totally,
um
totally,
record store or whatever. And the internet just made that impossible because everything could be
totally.
Googled. I mean, Google's kind of died now, so this is also why I think part of the vibe shift is like a re-embrace of some of these like niche and DIY things.
Because I actually
And
really want.
it
There's a few.
reacts to the
Yeah.
fact that Google and social media platforms are really disorganized, and it's really hard to find specific information at this point.
Yeah, no, I wanted that's one of several things I definitely want to hit. Obviously, these are kind of big cultural trend topics, and there's a number of directions we could go. But one of the things I wanted to hit is the vibe shift as a return to scenesterism and to kind of subculture and being into niche things, following not just normcore, which as we described was kind of reaction against hipsterism, but also kind of I guess what sort of came after normcore, what normcore turned into, which is um wokeism, I guess, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term. That was if normcore was a drive to find community and a group, like a more collective identity instead of values, like wokeism ended up being that thing for the sort of polite society, fashionable world. And now we've reacted against it, I guess, like a part of the vibe shift, undoubtedly. I don't think
Well, I
vibe
would
shift,
say
yeah,
at a
yeah,
high level, a lot of the reaction is also against the like aesthetics of, I don't know, Instagram activism.
yeah.
Like I think like Brad Tramel's
Mhm.
work is a really really funny response, this kind of points to also like, I don't think it's just entirely generational. I think it's kind of more attitudinal, I guess.
Hmm.
But someone like Brad, the last thing that he made that tricked a bunch of people was this. I think people call it corporate Memphis.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah, I
kind of
know.
like
Yeah.
flat, the flat drawings um of weird, hard to identify people.
Always very diverse and yeah.
I mean, theoretically, I think it's a cop out because kind of like the demands are so complex that like no one image can respond to all of them.
Hmm.
So it's easier to like just not put faces on people and
Yeah,
just do
yeah.
like a range of skin tones or something to cover your bases. But he made one about Taylor Swift's fans unionizing. Totally fake. A lot of people got tricked by it though, which is always funny, and that's also speaks to I think how good Brad is at replicating
Hmm.
the kind of tone and aesthetics of a certain kind of like Instagram posting. But
Yeah,
I think that's kind of what's become unfashionable, and that was kind of inevitable to me because that's
yeah.
the stuff that comes out of like I don't know, like teachers unions and like HR departments, and it's not
No one
cool
likes
or
that. Yeah, I mean,
sexy.
I was kind
I
of
mean, it's
predicting
like
that
it's
for
a
a
lot of
while.
a lot
Yeah,
of a lot of the leftist politics, in the 2010s started off very punk, and then
and
they
they
got very
turned into
and they
HR.
got
I'm
really
sorry. Yeah, they turned into
institutional.
HR. They
They
got
got
very
really
what?
institutional, and that's kind of always.
Totally.
I think that's been the story for every political movement ever, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's well,
That it
again,
becomes
there's these cycles that are perhaps
yeah, it
sometimes
becomes
patricidal, or maybe patricidal is even too Freudian. It's just this, things start off rebellious and become it is Freudian, they become the very thing they were rebelling against.
well, it's like
Anonymous.
something like K-hole was patricidal in that same sense, right? When we started it, it's like the era of Occupy Wall Street
Right. Same time,
and
basically.
warehouse
Yeah.
parties, and it's like peak hipster, and everyone's doing like zines. This is when you start like seeing like the art book fair at PS1 and the art book fair in Los Angeles. And we decided to make like a really corporate PDF
Yeah. No,
about
it's brilliant. Yeah.
consumerism when all of our friends were joining the DSA. So we were definitely tweaking people's noses.
No, it's great. Like, so I'm young, so I did want to, devote a chunk of this conversation to K-hole. I was young, so I wasn't like reading it when it came out, but I
Yeah.
familiarized myself with, at the end of the day, it's basically just 5 PDFs, which is funny. You were joking with me the other day,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, no, I mean
you guys gained total like fame and infamy based on 5 free PDFs, which
we
is
did the
pretty
branding
cool.
really well.
You did do the branding very well, and they're very entertaining to read. I think some people probably wouldn't really be sure what was going on with it at first glance. So I want to sort of ask about that, but just to sort of pay you a compliment, like
Yeah, no, I mean it was a
yeah,
weird
it's a weird
you know,
project, but yeah,
we started it when we had graduated college, which is like I don't know. I feel like everyone has a weird time. Our time was
yeah,
probably extra weird because we graduated in like '09, '10
into the
into
Great
the Great
Recession, yeah,
Recession. So there was definitely an angle that like we were trying to figure out how to get paid somewhat,
yeah.
so that wasn't not on our minds. Our interest
Hmm.
in, you know, not being baristas, which,
So that
you know,
influenced the
not
somewhat
not to be mean to
corporate
anyone who had to be
angle,
a
yeah,
barista after during the Great Recession, but like that was what everyone was trying to avoid, right?
hmm
Um and yeah, I mean it also it came together in a really kind of haphazard organic way because we didn't really know what we were doing, right? We
yeah.
had all graduated and we found these PDFs that were trend reports and we thought they were like interesting and funny.
Being put out
Um
by corporations and agencies for
yeah,
corporations that were not for
yeah, they
public
were.
consumption per se, right?
I think there used to be a bigger. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it wasn't bigger, but there was a different kind of vibe to it. I think there were a lot of like more like small batch producers of trend reports and
Yeah.
stuff. Because it's before you kind of have social media really take off.
Hmm.
It's before you have this idea that you can use the internet to
To
like
do your own
measure and
research, yeah,
quantify,
yeah,
yeah, what's going on socially. Which I have my own problems with some of that. But yeah, they were like a lot of like small bespoke PDFs and PowerPoint presentations talking about different changes in consumer preferences, and we thought they were funny. And I think we were also attracted to them because we had just gotten out of college, and maybe we were all a little burnt out on being good little theory heads
Yeah.
and writing like in like harsh academic language.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because I don't actually know that the writing style is like super accessible. Although that was kind of our intention, was to talk about things that were happening that affected everyone
It's
that other
reasonably
people didn't want to talk
accessible. It's
about.
more accessible than theory is. It's like sort of a blend of like I guess a little bit of theory, like critical theory almost type language, but much more so in the corporate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but also, it was. I think part of the reason why it was easier to do in the beginning and then got harder was that a lot of what I think we were covering retrospectively was kind of mobile internet being deployed, the smartphone being deployed, social media being deployed. So there was actually like quite a lot of change happening around us in terms of
Yeah.
consumerism and the creative industries because of all these different aspects. And I think when we closed up shop in 2016, I think part of that was that we were all moving in different directions, and it's hard to be in a collective with 5 people, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of personalities going on. It's like being in a band or something.
No,
It's kind of
totally.
common that sometimes you just feel like you've kind of completed the creative output that you could put together as a group.
Exactly. Because I mean, even though people thought I think K-hole was like this agency almost and like very corporate, at the end of the day, it really was an art project that was just made by like
No,
five.
I think at the end of the day we were not set up to be a business. Like, I mean, no one
Yeah.
would set up a business with like 5 people with all kind of doing roughly the same job except for Chris, our designer.
Yeah.
All doing the same thing and then having to come to a consensus.
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. It's
it was
not
the
really
era
what
of
like,
Occupy Wall Street, so we thought being non-hierarchical was like really smart. At the end of the day, though, it's really hard to be non-hierarchical. There's a reason why businesses are hierarchical. It's more efficient.
definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we weren't. I mean, we did transact. We worked with some companies. I think, but we just ultimately, I don't think we were that corporate.
No,
Um,
it's seemingly not
we
at
we
all. It
were more
seems like you
corporate
were a
than we
group of
thought.
friends.
Than
Yeah.
we were less corporate than we thought we were, rather.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was by 2016 though, I think some of those changes had kind of been figured out.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. But no,
And
just to
now I think
say,
we're going
like,
through another weird shift.
yeah, I
Like,
do think, yeah, vibe shift as you've called it. I
well,
think there, yeah,
I think a lot of it just has to do with one, there hasn't been that much like it's the total opposite of the early 2010s, right?
yeah,
Like the early 2020s are about there haven't been huge changes to consumerism or the media really. I
yeah,
mean, we're watching, I don't know, an endless kind of like Matryoshka doll of
yeah,
like Hollywood entertainment industry stuff into different streaming platforms.
hmm
Um but that's not really that new. Netflix has been around a long time. The iPhone hasn't really changed very much it since I don't know, maybe the front facing camera was the last really big shift in the
yeah,
iPhone. So that's not really new. Most young people can't even really remember a time before smartphones.
yeah,
Um, Social media, I mean, you look at when all these companies launched, they all launched in a pretty tight time period from the mid 2000s, maybe 2004 through like 2013. The
yeah,
last
yeah.
edition is TikTok, right?
Wait, no,
But it,
but even that was, yeah, like 2019. It got popular anyway.
yeah, but
Yeah,
but but also you have to, like, I don't know, when I think about my own personal kind of like platform preferences as a millennial, it's like it starts with like AOL Instant Messenger, and then
hmm
and then everyone was on LiveJournal, and then everyone was on Friendster, and then everyone was on MySpace, and then everyone was on Facebook, and
yeah,
then Twitter launched, and then Instagram, and then Snapchat, on and on and on. That's quite a lot of change versus the present, in which I don't know. Every once in a while, you get something like "Be Real," but they feel like kind of like more like a fart in the wind.
Yeah, I don't even know what
Um,
that is. Like, but it's not. I mean, crucially, these other even TikTok again being the last big one, ultimately affects us all. Even people who are like, I will never be on TikTok.
oh yeah,
And maybe some people never are, but you hear it when you're out in public. There's
I
certain
think
social media
unless
sites.
unless
Yeah,
you consume zero news, a lot of what TikTok and Twitter end up being are like kind of proving grounds for different stories that can be covered in the mainstream media.
yeah,
So
definitely.
it does end up filtering down, even if you're not like a huge TikTok user. But yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't think these things have been pretty consistent.
Hmm.
And then on top of it, this kind of shift from people having blogs and websites and kind of owning these little niches on the internet towards people having handles on platforms has meant, it's like how you can't use Google right now, right? Google
Yeah.
barely works. And you definitely can't Google like Instagram post.
Yeah.
Uh, it's hard to Google a tweet. Um, so increasingly, like all the kind of like user generated content on the internet is on these like, walled gardens that search engines can't really access.
Hmm.
So I think that's also why you see this interest in like weird niche content because you have to know about it to find it.
Yeah.
Um, and
So
so that,
it's an inversion of what was going on in the early 2010s. Like if in the early
yeah,
2010s, people were getting more connected, and that was killing the hipster vibe. Now it's the reemergence of sort of digital enclaves.
yes,
And I mean, one point I wanted to make earlier though is like it's not like it's I mean, maybe you would say it is, but it's not exactly a reemergence of hipsterdom as we've understood it. It's
I think
I've
it's
heard people
different.
describe it as like the pilled shift. I think you use that
I,
term
I,
and others
I think
have like,
people are, yeah, I think people are
yeah,
pilled. I don't know. I wrote a little bit about that. I mean, what I think the word pilled means, it's kind of like, I don't know, like a tent pole for a specific community, right? So
yeah,
like
it's like,
the like Bitcoiners say they're orange pilled. Um,
right.
I think I made a joke about people in New York City being newspaper pilled.
Yeah, I just like you can do it with I mean by definition a lot of the time the pills are like extremely niche things like I'm
Yeah,
Dugan pilled or something, but then like people talk a lot about like, oh, I finally got Taylor Swift pilled after years of being neutral toward her, you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
this new mimetic way of like meme word, and I think it has to do with what you were describing where it's not like I have been rationally like won over to this ideology or like I have gotten into this thing. It's more like it is like this overnight. It is like you went down a rabbit hole. Like we
Yeah,
experience all culture now, not quite all, but like a lot of culture, even pre-existing culture. It's not just new subcultures. It's like, we experience it all as a rabbit hole because we discover it in that way where it doesn't feel like we're like becoming hip per se or like or much less like getting in line with some mainstream culture. It's much more like, oh, like I got into this and it's like, oh, it's like overnight I got into this and like now I'm on that
yeah.
wavelength.
There's
It's
it's
yeah.
it's consumerist and it's hobbyist. But it also, I think, it speaks to this new presumption that nobody knows what you're talking about, which is kind
Yeah.
of what I have. Like, so even with the vibe shift, I think I told you about this, but like when the New York Magazine article came out, it was during Freeze Los Angeles. So I was on
Yeah.
West Coast time, and I like wake up in the morning and like, oh, I have like 500 notifications on Twitter or something. So I'm like, oh, this must this must mean the article got released. And there's like events and parties and whatever during Freeze. I'm hanging out with my friends who are still more like fully in the art world, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. They're like, "Oh, how are you doing?" It's like, "I'm going kind of like viral today. It's kind of weird." They're like, "What?" And then like, I don't know. There's so much going on that no one's really paying attention. Fine, but it took like maybe 2 weeks for some of my friends to be like, "Oh wow, like that really was a big deal." But it took some time for the meme to jump from Twitter to Instagram, which is where they get most of their like content from.
Yeah,
So I think that's kind of interesting. But
definitely.
yeah, I think people find meaning in following niche internet micro celebrities in the same way that people my age found meaning in liking really weird small bands.
Yeah, no, that seems, it's so hard to define what exactly the vibe shift is, but I think that piece you just articulated seems pretty crucial. Because it's a lot of these metaphors are tired, like, oh, like podcasting and like alternative literature is the new punk. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, but like it is true, not because, oh, we're all going to be so edgy and wear leather jackets. Like it's not like, oh, just because it's edgy, it's
Yes.
like punk. It's more like, no, literally the experience of discovering and consuming it is very analogous to that. And
Yes.
that's unescapable. Um,
Well,
Somewhat on this note, oh, go
I
on. Yeah.
think, well, I think part of it also is that a lot of the younger people who were coming out of the pandemic um were not allowed to socialize as much as
Yeah.
millennials were. Like they've kind of found some statistics to track this where I don't know, like the average like 12th grader today like socializes outside of their parents' home as much as like the average 8th grader did in like 2005 or something.
Dang.
I'm kind
No
of
doubt that's
I'm
true.
kind of
That's
like
crazy. Yeah.
making this up. I don't remember the
No, that
specifics, but
sounds right.
that's
Like,
the
yeah.
general gist of it, which is that young people stay home more, they interact through social media more, and then COVID on top of all that, closing the schools, closing the universities, made it even worse.
Yeah.
So I think part of the reason why you see like podcasts throwing parties, or
Hmm.
people going to like alt lit readings or whatever, is young people emerging from the pandemic and having a desire to socialize. And
Totally. Yeah. That's how
these
the
like
energy feels to me. Yeah.
these digital media objects that they care about deeply, becoming kind of an alibi for socializing or trying to find other people who have like similar interests to them, whatever. And
Yeah.
that seems to be like the driving force behind a lot of it.
Yeah. No, I think that
And I think
accounts
it's
for a lot of the energy. Yeah.
yeah, and I think millennials inherited a lot of subcultural infrastructure from Gen X that
Hmm.
all got wiped out in the 2010s
Right. It
because
was all about the underground band circuit and things like that that doesn't really exist anymore.
well, there used to be a lot of weird places for young people to party,
Yeah.
like I'm there used to be actual kind of like warehouse parties in Brooklyn, and people still party in Brooklyn, but like those warehouses have mostly been converted into like above board bars or clubs or something. It's not quite the same thing as like your friends living in kind of like an illegal live work squat and throwing ragers.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think also the kind of physical infrastructure of partying has changed in cities, and that's also made these different media products or internet personalities important again as just kind of like a because it's like a collective action problem,
Yeah. 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 You need like an organizing principle.
because
You know
in
what I mean?
New
Yeah.
York is always a bit easier, right?
Yeah.
Like because in New York everyone socializes outside of their home, so even though I don't know, there's not really a lot of like the crazy underground stuff in the way that I remember it years ago. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just too old, and there's a whole crazy thing happening that I'm just not picking up
Hard to
on.
know, but the
It
general
is
sense
true.
is not. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
really go to Brooklyn like I used to,
Yeah.
but yeah, but in LA, like it's a little different too.
Yeah.
Because still, even if you, I don't know, you can talk shit about Dime Square and whatever, but people, but if you were a young person who was like, I don't know, following all the stupid Times Square drama, and you moved to New York, you know, you would probably know that you could just go to Clandestino and or Finelli's and like see these people hanging out. Um, you know,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
so there's like still Times Square, even though it's kind of more of a meme than a physical place. It's still attached to a physical place. Um, but that's increasingly rare in I think most American cities now. Maybe that might change. I think because
Hmm.
uh, COVID just was such like a body blow to urban commercial real estate. you know?
Yeah.
So that maybe that'll change. Maybe there will be a lot more vacant unused space that young people can kind of commandeer and do cool stuff with for a relatively low price. That I think that would be great. But who knows? It's also, people always talk about how I feel like it was like millennials always being like, I wish New York was like the 70s. But that's like such a hard thing to replicate.
Yeah.
Uh, well, it's people tend to forget that it wasn't Detroit. New York was actually the biggest center of American manufacturing.
Hmm.
It was less like of a mono industry, like Detroit with the auto industry, because there was like sugar and clothing manufacturing and all this other weird stuff. Probably furniture, who knows? But
Yeah.
like the idea that all of Soho used to be factories is like kind of hard to wrap your mind around.
For sure.
And then, you ended up with a situation where you had like the financial and cultural center of the US with tons of abandoned real estate all over the place. And,
Yeah.
all of the kind of wealthy people who could theoretically be your patrons living pretty close by. Um, I don't think there's any place in the world that has that situation right now.
Yeah.
Where you have like lots of cheap abandoned industrial real estate and a bunch of like rich potential patrons all living in the same area. Um, so, I think that some of the ways in which we think like subcultures and undergrounds can work were dependent on some of the like weird economic trends of the late 20th century.
Definitely.
And
But yeah,
without
yeah.
them, it's a little bit harder to figure out how that happens. But maybe the work from home thing is such a body blow to commercial real estate that I don't know. Like
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the
I've always thought it'd
parties.
be really
Yeah.
cool if someone like did a nightclub in like an office building in the financial district on like the 60th floor of something.
It feels like that could happen. I mean, I don't know how abandoned a lot of that space is now, but it seems like ultimately it will be more so. And I mean, I think I get the gist of what you're saying in terms of the necessity of this kind of space. Like a lot of the interesting LA events I've been to are in old warehouses, but also as you said, like
LA
yeah.
does, it's true, have more weird industrial space than
Yeah, there's like a lot
New
of
York.
East Side. I mean, there's like a music venue I went to recently, which is an old where it's all this
I,
East Side warehouses that
I
are
actually
so cool.
feel
Yeah.
like the reason why that might be true is that like LA is the biggest port in the US.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
not necessarily like an industrial city the way New York was in like the 40s or the 50s,
Yeah.
but it does have a lot of industrial stuff going on because this is like the point of departure for a lot of shipments of goods from abroad.
Yeah.
Um, and New York has a big port too, but after containerization, they moved it to Elizabeth. So all the weird kind of industrial infrastructure that goes on around our kind of like import centric economy is going to be in New Jersey, which is just
Yeah.
too hard to get to for the hipsters.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, sort of to this point, you have a neat. I think this is not paywalled on 8 Ball. Your trend forecast, your trend report. Like, obviously the original Vibe Shift article from June 2021 is paywalled, but more recently you did like a little infograph where it's like a picture, of what do you call it? Did you call it an anatomy of a vibe shift, perhaps? And
Yeah,
it
I
shows
don't know. I think I've been calling them like trend diagnostics.
trend diagnose, and you kind of point out how like there needs to be a place,
Yeah,
and
well,
in
I
this
think
case, it's Times Square. Yeah,
cultural trends are stories.
yeah,
So I mean, it's I'm not really being like uh so hyper intellectual, but just being like, what's the who, what, where, when, why of how a trend kind of plays out.
yeah,
Because you do always need some group of first movers. I mean, I think this again is maybe like a bit of a departure point for me against maybe some other kind of like more corporate trend forecasters because I mean like what people mean by trend can be different things.
yeah,
So sometimes for businesses they really just want to know like what people are buying in very like narrow terms.
yeah,
But I'm always kind of more interested in like uh people's desires and behaviors changing.
hmm,
And I don't know, maybe I'll get some shit for saying this, but I do think that in the US, most of that happens in a couple of like big markets, Like it
Yeah.
happens in Miami, it happens in San Francisco, it happens in LA, it happens in New York, obviously. And those are still really the places where like a lot of these new ideas start and then disseminate. Like I had a
Yeah.
client once ask me for like which trends started in the suburbs, and I was like, oh God, I don't know. I
None,
mean, I'm
probably. Yeah.
well, I mean, I think again, it depends on how you use the word, right?
Yeah.
Like I like I guess maybe like gender reveal parties. I don't know.
Yeah. 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 It
But
depends how you use the
I
word. But
mean,
the
there's
big
definitely
tier vibe shift
I
stuff
don't
is
want to be
very early.
too
Yeah.
I don't want to come off as too much of a snob about how the suburbs are cultural wastelands because it feels like so
No, I don't think it's
90s.
snobby.
But
It's just,
it's
yeah.
more about what are the interests of people in this, like people who want to be important fashion designers or
Just
writers
don't
or
live in the suburbs.
filmmakers or whatever, people who want to make culture. You got to leave the suburbs because that's the industries aren't there to do such a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
um
And, traditionally suburban people are focused on raising families, which is not mutually
yeah,
exclusive
and well,
with art, but yeah,
part
it's
of
a
the
different
vibe shift thing
pursuit.
was me saying I think it's good that some of my friends just like moved upstate and had kids and
Oh, yeah,
whatever.
totally.
They all
Yeah.
seem really happy with their decision to have lovely children. And
Yeah.
so some of this is also like me kind of mm, me thinking about my friends' anxieties about becoming adults. Uh,
Yeah.
and
No, it seems like
and
it's
how
a big, big part of
I
it.
think I'm again I've said this a couple times, but I'm gay. I think when you're gay, you live on a different timeline, and most gay people don't get married.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier to be, a single adult with like a big social life if you're gay because there's lots of other gay men who are also single adults without kids,
Yeah.
with big social lives. Yeah, if you're in a suburb where most people have kids, probably fashion and culture might not be your primary um focus in life, and
Yeah, definitely.
I
Yeah.
don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Oh,
I
no, no, not at all. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's
I
interesting.
think if anything, the internet has really broadened um the number of people who can like lay claim to being involved in culture, and I don't know.
Yeah,
Is it
actually, it's
better? Is it
interesting.
worse? I think people are
Yeah.
much more ambivalent about it because if anything, everyone complains about, the internet and culture at large just feeling very stuck, like nothing new is happening. It's just an endless combinatronic regurgitation of different 20th century ideas.
Yeah.
And there's I don't know if I 100% agree with that, but there's something there, certainly. And it definitely has to do with like the decline in cultural institutions agenda setting for
Yeah.
the mass public. Like I don't know if I've fully written about this, but something I've talked about in the past is this idea that I think before the internet, we had various cultural institutions, and then we had the rise of like, um, I guess you could call them almost cultural managers.
Hmm.
Maybe call them cultural mandarins, but like an Anna Wintour or a Phil Spector
Yeah.
or a Rick Rubin.
Hmm.
He's maybe one of the last ones really
Yeah.
operating still, but being these kind of tastemakers who had access to both the capital to make something really big because it used to be a lot more expensive to make culture, and also were kind of at the ground level looking at new and interesting things and choosing who gets the money to become like a big cultural product and who
Yeah.
doesn't. And obviously that bothered a lot of people if they didn't get chosen, and most people don't get chosen.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't even think it was like a conspiracy so much as because these people lived in a small number of places and probably had some amount of interaction with each other. Like they're part of a class, a cultural class. Um that you could see these kind of big shifts happen, and then it kind of really trickle down all across culture because people just had less options,
Yeah.
So when I don't know, in the 90s when like, jeans became baggier, like everyone's jeans became baggier.
Yeah. There was more of a monoculture.
Yeah, and now
Yeah.
we have businesses have more information about people who do not want to participate in those
So they
changes
can cater
and
to
can
niche.
target them with products.
Yeah. Do you think monoculture could and perhaps will come back in some capacity, or is fragmentation pretty much what we
I
have for
don't
the
know. I
foreseeable
don't know.
future?
I mean, I would say that the 2010s were a decade of centralization in some respects, though.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, as we were talking
like I
about.
think
Yeah.
especially something like Instagram, the rise of like Instagram face, everyone's face is looking the same.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I do think there's still the mimetic potential for things to kind of go mass,
I mean, that's
but
perhaps
it
a human drive to make things go mass.
but the
Yeah.
biggest problem monoculture faces actually is how accessible all the best culture of the past is
Yeah.
today. We've never really had a cultural scenario in which listening to the newest thing is as easy as listening to like very old niche things.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where we are also. Like people used to
Yeah.
listen to the radio.
Yeah. Even I did.
Um
Like, when I was young enough.
like
Um,
I
yeah.
remember when Drake's album came out, maybe it was like it took a couple weeks for me to hear it.
Yeah.
And I think it was because my friend's like adapter for her car radio broke.
Yeah. And
So
this is
that was
probably
like
like
how I was like, oh,
2011.
is this
Yeah.
is this the new Drake album? Um, anyways, like people used to be much more of a captive audience, right? Like
Yeah.
there were like only so many channels, and uh ads were kind of ads had like a mimetic appeal because they were targeted towards like a big, broad middle of the country. Everyone saw the same ads, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. I don't know if we're ever gonna quite go back to that place
Yeah. I don't know
because
if we can, but
because
yeah.
people just it's like there's been this ongoing trend towards the amount of new music that people listen to on streaming services like Apple Music, Spotify, etc. Keeps declining, and the amount of what they call catalog, which is music that is at least a year and a half old, keeps climbing.
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't know if like you're ever gonna really flip that around.
Yeah. There's this reluctance to try new things because there's so many things that feel, I don't know, feel safer from the past. I guess
Well, but
all of
also the
these are, yeah.
reason, because like the whole payola thing, right? From the
Mhm.
past, part of that was based on what had been found through studies, which is that if you have someone listen to the same song over and over again, they start to like it.
Yeah.
So, so also, there's like some imprinting that these old mass culture, kind of cultural distribution models, whatever, had that the new models don't. Because
Yeah.
now you turn something on, if it's not to your taste, you can just immediately turn it off.
Right. I think that's why I think that element is why there is a resistance to really get into. I mean, there's kind of a dearth of new music now, seemingly, for a lot of people anyway. Obviously there's a lot of new music being made, but there's less of a, continually renewing, set of new songs and artists that we're exposed to, and similar even with movies. TV remains fairly novel, but I do think there's, yeah, because we can just turn it off immediately. I do think that has led to some of that
Well,
stagnation people complain
I
about.
think I think some of the problem also is that the model. I don't know. I saw something with Matt Damon. He was on that YouTube show, The Hot Ones.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with the show?
Not really.
So, oh wow,
Heard of it, but yeah.
a shame for you as an upstate New Yorker to not know about this. It's a chicken wing eating show, and the guy brings on
Oh, yeah.
celebrities, and then I think it's like
I
I
saw the
forget.
episode with Coolio, I think, of all people. But yeah.
Yeah, it goes from like one least hot to like I don't know, either 6 or 10 or something most
Yeah.
hot. And the celebrities eat the chicken wings and talk, and it's kind of funny because they start like tearing up and needing to blow their nose and
Yeah.
drinking milk while they're
Yeah.
being interviewed. But I saw one with Matt Damon recently, and he was talking about how the collapse of DVD sales had made it much harder to make like the kind of mid-market dramas and rom-coms and stuff that you saw in the 90s and the early
Yeah. In
2000s.
2000s. Yeah.
So and I think in the same way I've heard some friends say to me that like kind of like people who are part of like smaller indie bands that it used to be easier not to get rich, but you could support yourself
Yeah.
because people bought CDs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like even if you didn't have a huge following, you could support yourself off the merch, etc., to do these kind of more niche cultural things. And I mean, we're definitely returning to that somewhat. It happened first, obviously, for like podcasters, and now you have like Substack and all these different subscription models. I mean, even the New York Times is subscriber funded now, not advertising funded.
Yeah.
Um, so I there may be a point at which like a lot of these people who really got dicked over by the cultural winds in the 2010s have more opportunities in the future. But definitely
Yeah.
last decade it was not easy, I think, for a lot of the kind of smaller cultural producers that
That's
you know
interesting. Yeah,
that
because you
used to
do see
be
that
really
lack.
important to these scenes.
Yeah, and that's maybe part of why the podcaster is kind of the new band, and these are like the Substack writer or the indie lit writer. I mean, these are kind of all things that are more immediately easy to fund on a subscriber model than making music or making a film, which has
Yeah,
kind of a higher overhead. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I feel like with music, we could be seeing more of it, and I would like to see more of it. And there is Bandcamp, like the website, and there's a bit of that. But then the music is always assumed
I
to
I
be
think
free. But
I
yeah,
think the hard thing about it is more so because like I mean, just to even talk about subscriber models, when we started K-Hole, these PDFs, we released them for free because we were ideologically pro free
right.
information, which I've walked back personally. I don't actually think it's no,
Yeah,
I just think that it was a mistake to presume that everything should be free. Um
especially stuff like
and
K-hole and trend forecasting. It feels
well, it was but like
monetizable information sometimes. So yeah,
but but anyways, it was a mood that people wanted to do stuff for free or
yeah,
just
definitely post
upload
occupied.
upload
Yeah,
your song to YouTube, and the idea was you were going to go viral and then you're going to be famous, and then somehow the money would work itself out, which is a deeply bad way to go into anything in life. It's being like, I'm sure the money will just follow.
yeah,
but
yeah. It's probably good to keep
but
in mind. Yeah, yeah,
but we have seen a real shift, and people are willing to pay to read content again. So I think that's great.
yeah.
Right now with music, I don't know if we've seen that shift yet, and it's a little trickier, I think, because most people, even if you're small and slightly successful, you probably have a label. You don't have to be that famous or rich to get a label deal, but if you have a label, they're going to tell you, no, you have to put your music on Spotify. You have to put it on Apple Music. That's how everyone listens to everything. And then, by that point, you've given it away for free already.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess you get some money from Spotify, but I don't. Talking to music artists, like no one thinks that you get enough from Spotify. So
I think
it's
it's
not nothing, but it's yeah,
I saw some figure about how much money The Weeknd has gotten from his streams, and it was only like 25 million.
yeah. Which for perspective, I
Eh,
mean, I'm sure he's one of the
well,
most listened to artists.
that's
Yeah,
it's a lot of money for sure. He's doing fine otherwise. But the point is more so that like if he's like one of the best paid artists, and
yeah,
he's so famous and in like the 0.1%, or like he may even be like the biggest streamer on like Apple Music or Spotify or something. Uh 25 million isn't that much.
no, totally, yeah,
And that's
yeah,
also he's been around for I don't know how many years, a decade.
yeah. About a decade, little more. Yeah,
So but then you think about all the other people who are like, I don't know, they're getting checks for like $3.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know where the money's coming from always, but um, to reel it back a little bit, still on vibe shift. I talked earlier about how I learned the word normcore. In the case of vibe shift, I definitely kind of learned it more from like right word Twitter users, probably like March of last year.
I mean,
So
I think it's funny.
uh,
That's definitely one of the places where it's popular. Although I think there's a bunch
because
of
it's Red
I don't
Scare. I don't know. For me, vibe shift and Red Scare are like
know.
closely associated. Well, I was actually going to ask a question about that. Like, so when I was first introduced to it, I don't remember if it was introduced to me as this or if this was the assumption I immediately made. But I basically took it to mean the propensity for a certain segment of Gen Z and millennials kind of coming out of the pandemic to shift somewhat to the right or towards conservative ideas, or at the very least reacting against
So I
wokeism.
think
Like for me,
I
that
think
was my initial understanding of vibe shift. Now I realize
I think
it's
I'll
not
answer that
that,
question though.
but yeah,
It's very yes and no,
yeah,
because I think the reason it has that association is partially just because the left during the 2010s moved really far left, and I think also became
yeah,
offended by increasingly kind of like normie pseudo political middle of the road ideas. Um, and I think to some extent there's been like this kind of mass confusion about the political preferences of Americans, because Americans actually aren't that highly ideological, you know?
yeah,
And so I would say like yes, it's definitely a reaction against um quote unquote woke culture, whatever. But it's also, you know, people wanting to depoliticize things. You know, I think this is why you hear people now complaining about the anti-woke as much as the woke. Um,
yeah,
because
yeah,
if people were trying to exit something, they were trying to exit the kind of like constant cycle of outrage politics, you know,
yeah.
during
No,
the Trump,
totally.
it just wore people down. And I think a substantial number of people became increasingly indifferent to these things.
Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
it's but that's only people wanting to be apolitical is only right wing if you know you have a very specific left wing definition of those two terms. Like
Yeah,
I
which
don't
we
know if those
did.
people
We
are
did in
actually
like
super
2020.
right
Yeah.
wing. I think a lot of them are just looking to exit, you know, politics filling the void that pop culture used to.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, yes and no is the right answer there. Again, that was my initial take, but I kind of quickly realized
Well, because
that
I
that
also think
was
it's funny,
far from
like
the whole story. Yeah.
no, it's like, you know, Silicon Valley really took to the term, but also so did, I don't know, like a lot of like mainstream culture press, which is not particularly right wing.
Yeah, no,
Um,
because I was kind of when I again, this was my initial understanding based on who I was talking to, but when I
yeah,
started to dig in more and read the actual viral articles like the one for New York Magazine, I don't think Red Scare was even mentioned in that article. Like there's a completely different take on it, which is more simply,
no, but
you
also,
know,
you know, I Red Scare had been around for a while before the pandemic.
yeah,
I think maybe they, you know, they go through periods of riling people up.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's an
um,
argument that they've kind of. So I think it's probably you say yes and no. Is it a shift the right word or a shift more explicitly anti woke? I mean, I think it's in the case of some people, yes, but like as a broader phenomenon, that's not nearly
I
all that
think
it means. Yeah.
I think people were exhausted by like the, you know, circular firing squad
Oh yeah. How could you
dynamic
not
of
be?
political
Um.
discussions during the
Yeah.
Trump administration. And I think by the end of COVID, you know, where I mean, you had people screaming at each other over wearing masks in public, you know.
Yeah.
Um a lot of it, like there's a certain POV in which not wearing a mask in public is very right wing. I don't
But
agree with
like,
that.
no. Yeah. Yeah. Like
I
totally.
don't,
Like that's
but
insane. Actually.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it looked like
but
that
I
for a
think
few years
that
though. Yeah.
the exhaustion with the kind of like culture of public denunciation um between people who dislike one another for any variety of reasons, you know, it was just exhausting.
Totally. Well, that kind of brings me to another thing I wanted to ask about or propose, which is that, so most famous K-hole PDF was the one where you introduced the term normcore, which was at
Yeah,
issue 4, and it was not issue 4 normcore, it was issue 4 youth mode, a
youth
report on
mode.
freedom, right? A
Yeah,
report on freedom was the subtitle.
yes.
So that strikes me as like one of the, and I think you agree with this because I think I've heard you say it. But one of the perennial drivers of these types of vibe shifts um is the desire for freedom and youth, essentially, which are often viewed as being inseparable. And I think again, like to the extent that the left or prevailing progressive trends became synonymous with the lack of freedom because of the circular firing squads of wokeism, the censoriousness of wokeism, and then coupled with the literal physical restrictions of COVID, which also became
Yeah.
kind of a progressive pet issue. I think there was a very strong rejection of that. And I think it is only right wing in as far as it's defined as right wing by its friends and foes alike. But yeah, I mean, basically, I think that, just as
Well,
you said
also,
with Normcore, yeah,
I think when people claim that the left has become illiberal, they're talking about something real, you know.
yeah,
But I
definitely.
think the kind of small L liberal, kind of more left libertarian POV is, I don't know, very much a strong part of like America's cultural DNA.
Yeah, I think so
And
too.
so
And it kind of,
all kind of like protest movements that try to impose any top down solutions in the US tend to um be overturned relatively soon because of the just American cultural preferences.
yeah, and like that sort of leftward libertarian demographic was really very underserved, I
It's
guess,
like
from sort of Trump
it's like
onward. And yeah,
the hippie to yuppie
yeah.
trajectory of the late 60s to the early 80s.
Hmm.
Like I saw a Wall Street Journal poll recently where like basically all Americans reporting on the importance of a variety of values. I think one was like patriotism, religion, family, community, and money were the big five that they studied, and all of them were collapsing except money.
Yeah. Except for money.
Which feels
Yeah.
very it feels very 80s to me.
What, the moment we're in now?
Yes, and
Yeah.
also the fact that people seem tired of uh protesting and political discussions and more interested in like the more self-serving goals like earning lots of money.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this exhaustion with
It's
politics as a force like you talk about like politics replacing culture and like people.
well, it's like
Yeah.
for millennials, it started with Occupy Wall Street, and that was what 2011. Like
Yeah.
I feel like I know people who've been protesting for over a decade now.
Yeah.
And some of them have changed their minds about some of the things they believe, and some of them are just exhausted because they don't feel like they accomplished anything with all their
Yeah.
efforts. So it sounds a lot to me like the kind of exhaustion of the new left, in the early 80s.
Yeah. No, no, definitely. And I mean, again, I do think there's just this desire to no longer have to worry about what you say, not have to worry about being canceled. These are kind of tired topics, but I think yeah, I don't think the vibe shift is like just political in this way, but at the same time, I think these issues are never like they're never too far deep within the rafters or whatever. Like they're always there. That kind of exhaustion with cancel culture
No, it's
and
also
all
I don't
this.
know, just but like to me, like also I think the left right distinctions feel I don't know. Like I think a lot of there are like clearly lots of political problems, or we wouldn't have to talk about politics so much.
Yeah.
But it's also hard for me to really. It's hard for me to force it into a left right paradigm because I don't really know. I don't really know if we're living in an age of ideology. Um, it seems like things get fed through this ideological lens because that's like the tools people have at hand.
Hmm.
But something about it always feels kind of off to me.
Yeah, and I think especially now people want to move away from that. I mean, because at the end of the day, this is about, culture and culture rooted to places like the Dime Square adjacent events that I've been to in New York, and then also the equivalent ones we've tried to have here. Yeah, the feeling isn't so much political camaraderie; it's more just this sense of, especially like more immediately coming out of the pandemic, of this like wellspring of energy and like, oh, we're like socializing
Oh
in a
yeah,
group
I
and I don't
mean
have to worry what
people.
I'm saying. I think it's just
I mean
not
it
wanting
was
to worry
also
what
a
you're saying.
reaction
Yeah.
against tech. I think
Against tech.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think to some extent. Well, we're talking over Zoom right now, but you saw
Yeah.
all of these kind of remote models of doing IRL things have these huge booms and valuations and huge run-ups in the stock market. They've all pretty much collapsed.
Yeah.
And I mean, the funny thing about the US and COVID was that um people really all lived in entirely different realities throughout it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um Part of that was because every municipality, every state had slightly different rules, and those rules were followed to different
Hmm.
degrees by different groups of people in different places.
Yeah.
So you had some people who like never left the house until they got like their first COVID booster.
Yeah.
And then I knew other people who never locked down and were partying the whole time. So people had very different experiences of COVID. But
Hmm.
also I think um the COVID censorship regime, which was new, you know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
was a very new development. And it was very weird and I think off-putting to a lot of people. And I also think that a lot of people within tech saw this as a big opportunity. That we were really going to try and move all of daily life into the digital commons. And it was really a big failure because what we found out was that people really, really like being around other people, that it's like
Yeah.
one of the most core human desires.
Hmm.
It's like up there with like sex and shitting. Um,
Yeah.
and so people would rather brave a potentially deadly pandemic than
Yeah.
than like, do one more Zoom COVID drinks meeting.
Yeah.
No,
No,
but I
totally.
think that was part of it too. So it wasn't like an explicit tech lash, but I think tech ended up looking like much more of a school marm, and their responses to a lot of things felt really chaotic and incoherent. It was like a dog chasing a car and then catching it and not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's just because I don't know, throughout the 2010s we had these endless conversations around content moderation, et cetera. And again, here's like another thing that people have been talking about for a decade, but I it doesn't seem like anything good's come out of those discussions
Yeah.
because
About content owner.
we
Yeah.
don't have a good model for how we're really like working from year zero on how you should do content moderation for 10 billion people or something.
Yeah.
It just it's a totally novel question that's never existed in human history. And the fact that it seems impossible to answer just makes me feel like the Tower of Babel myth was correct or something.
Yeah, no, completely. Um, Let me just look through my outline here to make sure I'm hitting all the right notes. Well, to go back a little bit to something from earlier, I feel like we kind of got off topic on it, but which is
Uh,
fine. I don't mind jumping around. But yeah, what would you say the key like skill that you have both in doing your consulting work, but also in trend forecasting? Like, what is it? It's a way of viewing culture? Is it a head for sort of data and research? Like, what is it
uh,
about you that like really
I think
sparked
I
to
think
that?
it's a
Yeah.
media diet, and it's probably also just has to do with um having a cultural lifestyle, which sounds pretentious, but I think
No,
it's
I get what you mean.
true.
Just
Well, it's like
being,
I mean, I there's kind of two POVs on this. I'm in the like very small minority that thinks that marketing and trend forecasting more specifically is like more of a literary endeavor, that being in the world and identifying things is where
mhm.
like really interesting stuff comes from.
Yeah,
And I think that when you're just looking at data, one, it's always old, and two, it's hard to predict, when the line shifts, right? Like a
yeah,
lot of people were really surprised by this like Wall Street Journal poll about these like big five values, and seeing the community one go up, 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 and then crash.
yeah,
So like part of it is I think having a sense for like why things are going to crash, or why there's going to be a preference cascade. I think that might be a Mark Andreessen term.
Hmm.
Um, because when people try to do the big data stuff, they're just like they're always just extending the line infinitely into the future. And
Yeah,
to go
there's this
back to
lack
the
of
patricidal
understanding.
thing, like there's more of a cyclicality to a
Exactly.
lot of these things rather
Which
than it being linear.
totally, it's completely obvious to anyone who looks at history, cultural history, and just history in general,
Yeah.
just the general cyclicality of really everything, like all human endeavor, but people still manage to forget it, especially on like a kind of corporate level. Sometimes there's this like autistic sense that like, oh, if something's true, it like will always be true. But yeah, I definitely view that as something that you seem very cued into, and that kind of smart people in general are cued into is understanding that everything
But it's definitely about
that
like
rises
taste.
must fall.
It's
About
about
what?
taste too. It's
Yeah.
about taste. It's about like liking things or not liking things and questioning why you like them. Which I don't think people are always doing. I mean, it also probably means that the applicable nature of what I do depends on what kind of business it is, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because I'll be the first to say that not all businesses need to have their head in pop culture. I
Yeah.
like
Oh yeah.
in a very broad sense, they have to know about the national mood and which things people will like and which things people will dislike, but it's probably less complicated than I make it sometimes. So that also means that, you know, most of my clients are like people who make clothes or are in sportswear or apparel or fashion or tech, or music or culture, because you know it's more applicable to them than say like a bank,
Yeah.
car
Yeah. Yeah.
insurance. I don't know. There's different reasons why people choose different brands, and some of them have very strong um cultural associations, and some are pretty utilitarian.
Yeah. Interesting. Um, I just have this note on K-hole, not to keep bringing the conversation back to
Uh,
an earlier stage, but just to because I don't want to assume anyone who's listening has any familiarity with K-hole. You were talking to me about how kind of preceding K-hole was it? I think it was Greg you were working with at RISD
oh yeah, I mean
on
me
earlier like mockumentary style projects. Like, I guess just to make this question very simple, like to what extent this is my understanding of K-hole. It almost seems like it started like a little with a little bit of that mockumentary, like borderline satire, bringing together of art and corporate language. Like
yeah,
basically started as a borderline satire, but then it got pretty
it
serious
was it
once
was
some
a
of the
sincere satire. I think
yeah
that was how we initially framed it.
yeah
Yeah, no, because in school, you know, my thesis project ended up being, and I worked partially on it with Greg, who was later in K-hole, was, you know, about how you could make art objects that were like fakes or dupes. You know, so we made like
yeah
some fake documentaries that were set in the near past or the near future,
yeah alternative
and would
timelines.
create
Yeah.
like the kind of like digital ephemera around it to make it feel more real. Um, and K-hole definitely started with that same, like we wanted to make it feel like a real corporate trend
Like
report,
something
even
that
though
you
we were
just
like
find. Yeah, like a
five
yeah.
five art students working in a Google Doc.
Hmm.
But it's,
Yeah,
you know, that is like the same way that all branding works. You know,
exactly. I
every
mean,
every
yeah.
startup is trying to make itself feel like a legitimate business, even if it's relatively young and unworked out.
Yeah.
Um,
And the only question is like how much are you in on the joke? And you guys were pretty in on the joke, but that doesn't make the reporting any less
we were
sincere.
in on
Yeah.
the joke, but you know, I think we went about it in a way where it like so it wasn't supposed to be um like the Onion, you know.
Yeah.
It
No.
wasn't
Wasn't like haha
ironic.
funny. Yeah,
It
yeah.
wasn't ironic. It was satirical in that we were playing up the tropes of like
Like it
trend
seems like
forecasting and corporate
right.
culture.
The aesthetics were satirical, but the message was sincere almost.
Probably. I don't even know
Yeah.
that the aesthetics were that satirical. I think,
Mm.
we were pretty proud of how everything looked. We thought it
Oh
looked
no, it looks
good.
great, but it did
But
look corporate. It looked more corporate
yeah,
than
but
you guys
but
were.
we
Yeah.
we we had our own ambivalence, I think. We were ambivalent. That's probably the better term than satirical about
Because you
corporate
probably weren't
culture.
necessarily having these high level conversations about it. I mean, it probably just kind of evolved as you went through it. Would that be
Well,
fair
we
to say?
we kind of were, but it worked,
Yeah.
but it wasn't like we had a proposal that we executed. It was made. It, it was a process based work to some
Yeah.
extent.
And
Um,
just for listeners to this, these are still available if you look up K-hole, trend reporting or if you look up K-hole,
yeah,
you can
yeah,
get
the
stuff about
website's still
ketamine,
there,
but
khole.net.
and you can download these, and I do recommend it. I mean, I don't know if this is too early to say, but for me, they invoke some nostalgia for the early 2010s. As you can probably gather
Yeah, it
with
feels really
yeah,
innocent, doesn't it?
it does feel very innocent and sort of optimistic in a way. And that impact font and those like very corporate images, it just feels very evocative of a certain time and place. But
Well,
also like
I think a
insightful.
lot of a lot
Yeah.
of people who came out of the art world in the early 2010s, who were part of the quote unquote post-internet art movement, were artists interested in like the potential of the internet to let us do like mass things.
Yeah.
I don't really know. I think it didn't really work out as well as people had hoped to some extent.
Yeah. No, I think
But
not.
I think
But
some of
yeah.
that is just like youthful optimism, that
Yeah.
maybe that we thought it was easier to operate in these like huge industrial pop culture arenas than it actually was.
Hmm.
And also it was partially because we maybe over anticipated how interested the public might be in weird avant-garde digital products.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
you
Yeah.
know, but it's funny to think back on it because most of the post-internet stuff is all it's addressed to a general audience, not just an art audience.
Yeah.
And I think that was something specific to people around my age who grew up with the internet, who grew up during like the early eras of globalization, and who, millennials had a very extreme pop cultural diet.
Yeah.
And even though we weren't branded as millennials since we were babies, we did go through a bunch of weird, different, like kind of consumer personas. The millennials were the ones who were the tweens.
Right.
Like that was a new consumer demo for like, I don't
Yeah.
know, like 10 to 13-year-olds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there was the whole hipster era was another kind of millennial consumer demographic that was kind
Totally.
of
Yeah.
uh invented to some degree by
Hmm.
marketers, and then the actual millennial demo, which starts to happen maybe around 2013, where you see things having the quote unquote millennial aesthetic, like very like Emmett Shine really
Hmm.
innovated that with Sweet Green and Harry's, and
Oh yeah,
um
yeah. Very
yeah, like all these direct to consumer brands that had like a very like slick affect. So the millennials have always been a pretty pro consumerism generation, like their boomer parents.
yeah, because of
Um
the size of the generation, they're important
yeah,
economically,
yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
And Gen Z, I think, is just smaller. So they do ultimately have like I think a little bit less of an imprint. Because even right now, you see a lot of marketing shifting towards millennials. I mean, they're not
Yeah,
doing as well as their parents, but they have way more money than Gen Z. And a lot
yeah,
of them are in that that like life transitions tend to be kind of consumer sweet spots, right?
yeah.
Because it's like, oh,
And
you bought a
millennials are
house,
like
now you have to
permanently
fill
in
your house with
transition.
stuff.
Yeah.
You had a
Yeah,
kid,
no,
now you have
totally.
to give
Yeah.
your kid tons of stuff. Um, and I'm not negging on that, but it's just true. So you have a bunch of millennials becoming adults. So you see like homewares doing really well,
Hmm.
and you see homewares responding to a lot of like I don't know millennial aesthetic trends in terms of like I don't know, like you go on Wayfair and it's just endless rip off mid-century modern
Yeah.
pieces of furniture. blah blah blah. But yeah, so I think you'll still see the millennials leaving a really big imprint.
For sure.
And I also noticed from work that like, a lot of um luxury real estate is really retooling itself around millennial tastes. Luxury travel is really retooling itself around millennial tastes.
Hmm.
um I mean, traditionally, and it's not fair, but it's true, marketing tends to orient itself towards kind of, I don't know, the top 20% of the income bracket.
Yeah.
So also a lot of these companies are preparing for millennials parents to die and for them to inherit some chunk of change from that.
Hmm.
um so, people are still really fixated on the millennials, even if Gen Z gets a lot more of the like chattering class going just because they're new.
Yeah, 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 no, totally. Because as we kind of said, millennials are still the bigger demographic. I think in a really interesting way, you talk about like transition being a good, the trend life transitions as always being market opportunities, and one kind of definition of millennials in a way, and maybe Gen Z will be similar, but because there is this kind of Peter Pan ism, definitely with millennials, and we'll see if it really applies to Gen Z, maybe less so to Gen Z. Anyway,
Well,
it's almost like millennials,
Gen
yeah,
Z, I mean, Gen Z's upbringing is good and bad in that millennials really lived through like a very optimistic time period.
yeah,
The late 90s, even with 9/11, the early 2000s were a pretty happy period in the United
yeah,
States when you look at
yes,
like public polls. Um so, the general problem that millennials have is that they feel like they were promised something, and that kind of whole economic infrastructure and all the trade-offs that they learned about growing up just didn't really work out quite the way that it was presented to them.
totally.
So millennials, I think, are a little bit crankier
Yeah, they are
than the
now
younger
anyway. We are
cohort
now.
because they
Yeah.
feel, yeah, because they feel like something was taken from them. Whereas I think Gen Z, I mean, this is like classic stuff. They're a bit more pragmatic and wary of like with millennials, you saw a huge boom in people going to art school.
Yeah. Which is fundamentally a very optimistic act.
Totally,
Yeah,
totally. It's like it's something you only do if you don't think anything bad is going to
yeah.
happen.
Right.
Um, and you see that drop off, but also just like the idea that you should like study what you love. Like I think millennials had like a really earnest relationship to higher education,
Yeah,
really meaningful. They really bought into the branding of higher education more than anything. Like
totally.
higher ed and
Yeah.
Apple did a number on millennials.
Yeah, no, no, no.
And
This
I think
all
when you
resonates
talk
as
to
a younger
younger
millennial.
people,
Yeah.
they seem much more concerned about like the budgetary implications of studying one thing versus another, or studying anything at all. They're definitely more pragmatic, and they definitely don't have this presumption that if you just do the right things, everything's going to work out okay.
Yeah, and which is more reality pilled, shall we say.
Yeah, yeah, no,
um,
totally. Well, because
definitely.
they grew up after the Great Recession, and the
Yeah.
Trump era. I mean, the 2010s were
COVID, of
messy.
course. Yeah,
COVID,
messy, messy,
yeah.
messy. Yeah. Um, yeah,
So
no, I was
I'm
gonna
not
say,
surprised.
I just kind of had this thought while you were talking about. I'm curious if it resonates with you as a millennial. It's almost like, again, because transitions are like a marketing opportunity, and maybe this is a psyop to some extent because of this. But in many ways, the experience of being a millennial kind of feels like you're permanently in a transition, like you're permanently about to finally grow up or something, but not quite getting there. Does that resonate at all?
I mean, I think that's kind of true. It's just very real that this has to do with, I think, just a rapid amount of change that kind of happened in the 2010s. But
Yeah,
uh even when you look at like the number of millennials that are going to get married,
yeah,
there's a good chance that maybe 25% of like millennial men will never get married or something.
yeah, yeah,
um and part of that just has to do with expectations that millennials grew up with from their parents' generation about the kind of order of operations to being an adult, and home
yeah.
ownership was a big part of that.
Yep.
um But millennials are like, I feel like people argue about this, and it's true that millennials are probably unrealistic in their expectations, but that makes perfect sense because they were raised by a generation that had unrealistic expectations, but had them mostly kind of fulfilled in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, if you're cut out of the housing market, then people don't get married, then people don't have kids. Um, so I think that that's also kind of part of it. We've seen the labor economy, the labor market change pretty drastically. A lot
Hmm.
more people are self.
You still
Yeah.
there? Sorry, a lot. We were saying a lot more people, and then you cut off. A lot more people are
Oh, a lot.
self-employed.
Well,
Yeah.
oh yeah, a lot more people are self-employed.
Hmm.
At the lower end, a lot more people are gig workers. You know, your parents tell you, go to the best school you can get into, and then
Yeah.
move to the biggest city you can afford to move to, and then you have like kind of these weird conflicts where like the highest paying jobs are in the most expensive real estate markets, and
Hmm.
people have a lot of student debt left over from maybe making overly optimistic decisions when they were in college and really young. And it's not entirely clear how any of this stuff sorts itself out without a lot of people being upset by the outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then at the same time, no one seems fully prepared for what the kind of knockdown cultural and political implications of that are, which I presume are probably like not that good. Like having lots of people feel super unfulfilled in their lives is like a recipe for political instability, always has
Hmm.
been. So there's that issue is there too. Like I do think like more broadly, like things are going to get much more nutty when the boomers are gone, as much as people
Yeah.
like to blame them,
No.
because the
Yeah. I
boomers are
agree.
kind of the
Yeah.
last ones who just really believe in the institutional validity of a lot of things in the US that I think millennials and Gen Z are much more skeptical of. That
Absolutely.
doesn't mean they all have the same ways in which they're skeptical, but generally there's a lot more institutional distrust.
Yeah. Absolutely. I have another question penciled in here. I think I know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. So in terms of the vibe shift, you would say it's more driven by, well, okay, I mean, you would say it's more driven by Gen Z than millennials, or is it kind of a mix, or is it like a lot of like older Gen Z, younger millennial? Because in some ways, it kind of you talked about it earlier as like this cultural moment of vibe shift is marked by emerging from the pandemic, and the millennials are not the young or cool ones anymore.
I
There's this
I
Gen
think
Z
I
and
think
Z,
it's I
but
think
there's
it's more
still,
Gen Z.
yeah, seemingly they're ultimately the drivers. Yet within that, there are a lot of millennials who would like be seen as, and almost more millennials who would be seen as like influencers, I guess. Again, to talk about Red Scare, they're
Yeah,
millennials.
well, but
Like there's
part of that
no
has
doubt there's a lot of millennials who are like making it in the vibe shift, and Kate, but like Gen Z are the definitely the consumers and the ones who are really being molded by this is kind of my impression.
yeah, well, I think partially to go back to what I was saying, it has to do with the deinstitutionalization of American cultural life.
Hmm.
So a lot of the millennials that seem to be influential to younger people are people who exist outside of traditional
The people who
institutions.
booked, yeah, I mean, again, that's on
It's
your
like they're not
diagnostic.
these
The
the young
declining
people in Times
trust.
Square
Yeah.
aren't super interested in I don't know, like New York Times op-ed writer.
Exactly. They don't give a shit.
So
That's a good point. Whereas like Red Scare and other similar podcasts, like they also probably don't care about New York op-ed writers, but like maybe they used to. Like there's kind of a more conscious
well,
bucking of
I would
that.
say that
Yeah.
a lot of millennials who do well on the digitally as part of internet culture haven't done well culturally as part of like traditional institutions of culture in the US.
Yes, I
You
think
know.
that's true. But then from like a Gen Z perspective, they're sort of the cool ones, or could be seen that way.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah.
they're the culture, like when you like it's like that guy Peter Turchin
Yeah. Elite
says
overproduction.
elite overproduction,
Yes.
that's definitely a millennial problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um
Totally.
but
Huge
then
part of
also
this.
you end up with like these like shadow scenes, like Times Square,
Yeah.
that are cool because they are kind of like the
Misfit
counterfaction.
elite. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think
Yeah,
that's,
and
yeah, that sums it up
it
very
makes
well.
perfect sense to me why young people who want to be cool and subcultural, which is always about kind of rejecting mainstream norms, would gravitate towards this kind of like ready-made set of internet figures
Yeah, no, totally.
that have quite a lot of traction online, even if they're not, even if that's not like translating into like I don't know, it's like, you know, Dasha and Anna aren't ever gonna get the Harry and Meghan Spotify Netflix treatment.
No, but like, what Harry and Meghan just like got booted off, or like they didn't get renewed on Spotify. So it goes, I
Well,
don't know,
because they didn't do anything.
because they didn't do anything. It goes to
They
show
didn't
like
do anything.
there's this desire to like get a piece of the podcast pie, but it actually works a lot
But I think,
less well. It's like AM yeah, it's like AM radio. Like it's naturally not necessarily naturally right wing, as we discussed earlier. This isn't really about right versus left, but it's naturally kind of reactionary. It works better if you are this kind of misfit populist pro freedom, fuck the institutions kind of message.
yeah, I
Somehow
mean,
it just lends itself to the medium.
I also
Yeah.
think that my opinion on most cultural institutions isn't necessarily they're like evil and up to get everyone interesting or
No,
something.
yeah.
It's just that they became too highly competitive, and I also think most of them did a really bad job of transitioning to like a more internet centric culture moment.
Yes, naturally they struggled with that.
And that's kind of part of the reason why the niche internet micro celebrities seem to have more social and cultural capital than a lot of people who have more traditional positions within like, storied institutions.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to.
And that
Yeah,
also
keep
seems
going.
to be a mutual frustration between both sides, I think.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Like Dasha and Anna, the Red Scare girls, just they're such lightning rods.
Yeah. Yeah.
People
No,
have been take them down for, and I know people will say it's just because they say offensive things, and it's obvious that they've offended people, but the interest in them is I find kind of amusing,
Yeah, the interest
because I
in
feel like
them.
in another era, people would have just kind of ignored them if they didn't like them so much, instead of trying to engineer some cancellation or downfall for them. But there's something really funny about it. Like there seems to be like some like the kind of the mainstream press's resentment of them I find funny.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's probably resentment's probably the word. I think they
But there's just
resent
something
their
funny
popularity.
about like
Yeah.
I don't know.
And they're literally
the New York Times
it is
resenting like this podcast.
Yeah, well, they actually in their chat with Delicious Tacos, which I listened to this past week, it's the first episode I listened to in a while. But they talk about how there's the one podcast where like where when people kind of grow out of listening to it, they feel like they need to make like a statement about why they've come to reject it. And there's like some famous like New York Times op-eds where it's like I don't even know. I should know the person's name to be referencing it, but it's like some guy who's like walking. It's like a famous op-ed, and he describes the scene like he was walking his dog across the Brooklyn Bridge and realized that like these girls were actually fascists and all this stuff. I don't know. There's this drive to really renounce them. The podcast, the Red Scare is so casual and it's kind of funny, but like
it's
no one can treat it that way.
It's incredibly niche. And I'm not trying to be condescending to Dasha and Anna in any way, but it is not like a huge mainstream talking point. If you leave like I said, like Miami, New York, LA, San Francisco, like this isn't like it doesn't weigh on people,
No, it doesn't. But at the same time,
I found it really funny when through the Maddie Healy kind of controversy that like all these like Swifties were like listening to Red Scare episodes because of him and being like really shocked and horrified. But there was just something, I don't know, amusing
definitely
about it like emerging into like a more like, because the Swifties are huge. There's tons of Swifties.
Right. Like Taylor Swift is kind of the last example, or like one of the last examples
She's
of that kind of celebrity.
I wouldn't say she's the last. Her, Beyonce, and Kanye West are kind of like
basically
traditional
Kanye's
celebrities.
Obviously pilled and all manner of has kind of embraced this shift.
Kanye's a whole different conversation, but these like there's a reason why they still have these fans, and it's because they kind of became major celebrities just before
Yeah,
social media really took off,
exactly.
when we still had a pretty
2008,
traditional. Yeah,
basically. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
And so they're kind of the last one standing because you just can't really replicate their trajectories in the new media environment we have.
yeah. But
But
you,
it's funny to
yeah,
see them work as conduits for like relatively niche content to like audiences that it's definitely not meant for.
yeah. But like there is like a mimetic potential there. I mean, I think this ties into vibe shift and just the shifting nature of the way we consume content, where it can be very hard to gauge like what fame even means. I mean, I think Red Scare, because of Maddie Healy most recently, but other, Lena Dunham, I guess, as a fan, like they come up like everyone. I don't know. There's so many people who are like famous in a way where it's like more household names, like people that are household names are familiar with, say, Red Scare, but they themselves are not a household name. Like that's almost like the highest level of fame you can reach, and but because
Yeah,
there's all,
well,
and like maybe they'll get some famous guests,
it's
but it
why
becomes
I mean,
very inscrutable.
celebrities,
Yeah,
LA celebrities seem to have a soft spot for Dime Square. And I think
yeah,
it's because partially it's because they're edgy, and there's not really that much in pop culture that's edgy anymore.
yeah,
And part of it's also because it's like it's a scene. It's one of the last like scenes that people feel like is you have to be in the know to even like get a grapple
yeah.
with it.
It's a well, again,
Um,
that also is just kind of the essence of this whole vibe shift topic in a way. I mean,
yeah, so
during the
it's like
pandemic, it's like a lot of us were kind of, yeah,
celebrities want to have a fun cultural lifestyle too, because I
yeah,
don't I think people probably overestimate how fun it is to be a celebrity.
yeah.
I think it's mostly just like a lot of work.
Hmm.
And I
But
think
but
it's
but
not.
like being
I
a
don't think it's
scene is
that
fun.
avant garde anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
But clearly, they're all creative people who care about art and culture and want to interact with people who are doing interesting things, even if maybe their fans would dislike them.
yeah, and that opens the door to, yeah, this kind of new
But I don't
mainstreamism.
think
Yeah,
it's ever going to be. I don't think Red Scare is ever going to be mainstream the way, say, like Joe Rogan is.
right. I guess if Joe Rogan, I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess Joe Rogan is mainstream, although he's also sort of part of this pilled shift in a way. In some ways, he's kind of a
But
progenitor, but
he's one of the last big names too, though. Like
he is, yeah.
he was a reality show host
I didn't even
originally.
realize that until like more like I just knew him as like, Joe Rogan experiences. Like, and I was like, oh my God, that was the Fear Factor guy. I had no idea.
Yeah,
But
but I mean, I
yeah,
use my little brother a bit as like a dowser for what's mainstream because I mean, he's not like techno illiterate, but he's not a big internet guy.
yeah.
I mean, he's 12 years younger than me, and I think I know about a lot more contemporary memes than he does. He likes, hunting and camping and stuff. But he listens to Rogan, so I was like,
Yeah.
okay, that's it's interesting to me what things he's interested in because he's not a cultural consumer like my friends in New York and Los Angeles are.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, like case in point, like I maybe I'm wrong with this, but I imagine Joe Rogan knows who Red Scare is, and like I don't know if he's a listener, but like he's cued into that scene, but like is a much more mainstream person,
Yeah,
so it becomes hard
like
to
I
get.
was saying,
Yeah,
I think people who live cultural lifestyles and are interested in culture know more about these things because that's to their taste.
yeah, definitely.
But the mass audience, I think, oftentimes finds these things confusing and weird, and they don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I don't want to keep you all night, so just let me know if you need to hop. But I'll probably just wrap up with a few more questions if that sounds
Cool.
good.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
problem.
Okay, so like kind of rapid fire trend questions. I asked you this in person, but I'll ask it again now. Are skinny jeans still cool?
I think it depends.
Yeah, no,
Well,
that's
what I
fair.
told you is that the
Yeah.
funny thing about denim, and this goes back to what I said earlier about how most apparel purchases are workwear, are people, buying stuff to go to work every day in.
Yeah.
I think skinny jeans, because they're elastic blend and they're easy to style, will remain the best selling jeans for quite a while.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of that is like because it's like for people like my mom who wears them the way she wore multicolored tights with tunics in the 90s.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I don't think that they're very cool, but um we're kind of getting there in that the I think the boot cut and like the flared cut haven't really crossed over into mainstream consumption,
Yeah.
but I think they probably will.
But it might be another like
And I
four or
think
five
that will
years
be the
because again, this
entry
is
point
slow.
to
Yeah.
to for skinny jeans to be transgressive again, because people forget. You
They
like,
were
when
transgressive.
I
Yeah.
when I started wearing skinny jeans, you couldn't buy them. You know,
Yeah. You'd have to
like
literally buy
I we had
girls'
to
jeans.
make them
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah.
my my friends with sewing machines would take in my jeans and turn them into skinny jeans. Before like cheap Mondays started being sold at Urban Outfitters, and that was kind of
Yeah.
the first introduction of elastic blend denim that's like taken over the entire industry. But
Interesting.
people really didn't like them. Like
Yeah.
I
No, no, no.
I got
Even like,
insulted to my face all the time for wearing them. So they were a transgressive clothing item circa like 2005, 2006.
yeah,
And
changed
then
around
they
like
went really
2009.
mass and became like the most normy thing possible, which is super amusing to me.
It is.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think for them to be like cool in the way they were will take quite some time, but
Yeah.
but
Seems
they're
like
still
it.
going to be the most bought pair of jeans. But that's people tend to confuse things being cool with things being popular.
Yeah. 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 So I guess that's a two-pronged question. So
I
skinny
think they're
jeans
the most
are
popular
popular, but
jeans,
not
but they are
cool.
not the
Yeah.
coolest jeans.
Yeah. Yeah. They're not that uncool either, though. It's like they're just very,
Well,
yeah,
they're in
very
a weird
neutral.
place because I
Yeah.
mean, and this speaks to kind of what I was saying earlier about how these trends used to be kind of managed from above by different, personalities in different industries that would really kind of like set the agenda for what kind of clothes would be sold. So I think we don't have those people anymore, and this is why over the last couple of years you've just seen a proliferation of confusion and angst amongst kind of like fashion writers about what fit of jeans to buy,
Yeah.
because they feel like there used to be an answer to what like the fit of jean you should buy should be, and now it could be anything.
Interesting. Other trend question. Do you still predict the music wise, the return of rock?
Totally,
Yeah. Because I
totally. I
wanted
mean,
to descend.
it's
I mean, I
it's
don't know,
happening in a
but
it's
yeah.
happening in a classic rock vernacular. um like so a couple It's definitely happening through television, one, which
Hmm.
through some of the research I've done, a lot of young people I talk to talk about getting their style inspirations from TV, which I
Yeah,
think is interesting. And we're
definitely.
definitely in a moment where there's lots and lots of either TV shows set in the past, like Yellow Jackets about the teen girl
Yeah.
cannibals, and
Yep.
the whole soundtrack's like Smashing Pumpkins, um,
Yeah.
or Tegan and Sarah. I don't. Do
Oh
you know do you know who
man.
Tegan and Sarah are?
Of course, I was a hipster
Okay, but
too.
do you know that there's a TV show on Amazon Prime about their rise to fame in high school?
Think I did know that, but it's a fiction. Yeah, it's like a
But
like
again,
they
it's
have
like,
someone playing. Yeah.
it's all like late 90s indie punk, riot girl rock.
Yeah.
Um yeah,
No,
and then
yeah,
also
yeah,
the new really popular show The Bear has
right.
tons and tons of, or even the Idol, in
Yeah.
the most recent pool scene, what are they listening to at the pool party? Deftones.
Yeah,
So a
I
lot of it's
noted
coming
that. Yeah.
through via like people being interested in rock bands from the late 90s, the 2000s.
Yeah, and I myself have kind of gone on a kick of that recently. So it definitely feels like it's time for that to happen. My only skepticism is like, where is this actual music being made? I mean, I think there's a return of rock in terms of style, and again in terms of like going back to the old catalog on Spotify. But like, I just haven't really seen these new bands emerge.
I see some here in LA and here in New York, and
Hmm.
over in New York, and I think the tricky bit is it's not that easy to start a band.
Yeah,
Um,
especially now with there
yeah,
not being as much of a
and
scene.
also
Yeah.
a lot of them are pretty new.
Yeah.
Um, I think the internet has really primed us for cultural things to happen in like this like hockey stick manner where all of a sudden like people want something and then it starts happening. But you kind of do have to cultivate a scene to create these bands. But I don't know, but you look at someone like Eve Toomer, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
the Strokes are
Interesting.
releasing a new album that Rick Rubin worked on. So I,
Yeah.
I think I think it's still coming, but again, we live in an era where you're fighting the headwind of like all this classic, amazing music from the not so distant past, that people really like. So, so I think we're gonna have to get used to nostalgia being the first mover for a lot of cultural
Yeah, I
happenings.
mean we're already very much there. I mean, for me, so I did want to talk briefly because talk about Dime Square. Another vibe shift touch point is indie, what others call indie sleaze, what you call
Yeah,
naughty
I,
oddies nostalgia.
I'm
Yeah.
fine with. I think Mandy from Brooklyn, who's like a TikTok trend forecaster, coined the
Yeah.
term indie sleaze, and I think I think it's funny to me in that that's very much the moment that she's referring to is very much like me and like college, so it's like my early 20s,
Yeah.
fun time. No, definitely no one would have called any of that like indie sleaze.
The
Like there
word
was like
sleaze wouldn't have come up. I mean, but it is some of it was sleazy, no doubt. So
yeah, well,
yeah.
I think she's referring to kind of like the American Apparel aesthetics, and
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. Which
it was definitely sleazy, and people looked dirty and sweaty and horny, and people did
yeah.
too many drugs and got really drunk, and there were lots of insane parties. But yeah, that seems pretty clear that that's been like an interest area. I think part of the reason why people are interested in it, or even like the Cobra Snake kind of reemerging and becoming a party photographer again,
Yeah.
is that like those images from that time period are really evocative, and I think that it's not that far away from a lot of
It's
young
not.
people, and
Yeah.
I think when they look at those images and hear stories about the past, they want to replicate that level of hedonism and fun that
Yeah, because
some
it came to
millennials
such a
participated in.
yeah, and it came to
It
such
was
a
definitely
grinding
a
halt. Yeah.
subculture though, like that, like the kind of hipster moment and indie pop moment was definitely not the norm.
Yeah.
um so like all these things are like coming up against, and a lot of this is I think just comes out of us having too many tools to measure too much,
Hmm.
where people get frustrated because like, well, why are the cool things not popular things?
Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of always been the case, but um I don't know, people didn't have the tools to like say like you should ignore these skinny jean wearing hipsters. It's not popular. Everyone hates skinny jeans. But also if that had happened, you wouldn't have seen, I don't know, the way American men wear pants be totally switched around for a decade.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, I was just going to comment because the Dare seems to be kind of the band of the moment, and you mentioned like nostalgia is sort of the
Yeah, I went to his show at El Cid in LA, and I really enjoyed it. I liked his
yeah.
new songs. It was
I
really
was
fun.
yeah.
It
I
was
mean, from
high
my
energy.
perspective, I wasn't at that
It's
show.
definitely
Yeah,
it's definitely disco punk. It
yeah, like
reminds me a
LCD
lot of the
sound system,
Rapture. Yeah,
basically.
the Rapture
Like and
LCD
that
sound system.
because I get like burnt out on nostalgia. My initial reaction to the Dare was like, okay, this is kind of just LCD sound system repackaged. But I've kind of gotten more into it, and I mean, I think the tricky thing for rock bands or really just any musicians going forward is to like, the appeal does initially have to be nostalgic, but like, how do you make something new? Is I think the challenge. But I don't know. There's a lot of indie-ish musicians like RL Pink and John Mouse and people like that have managed to be both very nostalgic and also totally new at the same time. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I like it. It's fun.
it is
I went
fun,
to
definitely.
one of his parties, frequencies at Home Sweet Home in New York briefly.
Yeah,
Um, I I like whenever anyone is helping other people have a good time. There was certainly like
Yeah.
a dearth of that for a while
Yeah.
in the late 2010s, certainly during COVID.
Certainly during COVID. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think young people dancing and having fun, I always think is net good.
Totally. I'm with you there. Before we wrap, I feel like you could probably talk about this for some time. But one thing, but I'll just give you the chance to talk about it briefly because it's personal to you and also personal to me. We're both from upstate New York. I'm from
Oh yeah, I love upstate New York.
Syracuse. Went to school in Ithaca. You are from Geneva. You
Yeah.
just want to comment the in a nutshell version of sort of how being from the Finger Lakes affected your outlook, or how it, you
Oh,
still go there often. Yeah.
the Finger Lakes are a weird place to be from. People are very attached to them regionally.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just it's a weird mix because they're pretty rural.
Yeah.
Um, but they're like left-leaning rural, at least in so much as that exists in the US.
Yeah. No, totally. That's my impression
And
of it
so
as
like you
well. Yeah.
really, you grow up in this like small town environment that's really interested in like, the women's rights movement because of Seneca Falls and
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
and like abolition because of like Frederick Douglass and
Hmm.
Sojourner Truth. It's definitely like a place that is very attached to a certain kind of Americana that I feel like a lot of people think is maybe unfashionable in the 2020s. But also I for a while I was trying to write about an article about what I was terming the Hudsonization of rural America,
Yeah.
because rural America, especially in the Northeast, has changed pretty substantially since COVID, because a lot of people have begun moving there because the housing's cheap. Culturally, it's not as alienating as I think a lot of people perhaps might have thought it would be if they weren't from there originally. Um, and a lot of these towns are, nice little walkable, old-fashioned places
Yeah.
with like really yummy locavore food, and there's lots of hippies making pies and whatever. Um, and and I think generally like it's a beautiful kind of area. So I'm kind of interested in this. I think there's some like weird class dynamics to this because you see the housing prices shooting up, but also most of these small places needed an infusion of money or they were going to die.
Yeah.
So you have like this kind of weird dynamic going on where and I say Hudson dies because I mean I guess it's gentrification, but that word feels so urban in
Hmm.
its outlook that it feels wrong.
Yeah.
But
Right. It
Hudson
is.
does
Yeah.
seem kind of like the template of like what a lot of people are trying to do to their small towns to make them
Yeah.
appealing.
Yeah.
And
Definitely. Yeah. Just a little
I'll
stereotype. Yeah.
admit I like it. I like I like my friend Josh's third wave coffee shop, and
Yeah. I mean, listen, I like those
I like my
amenities as
friend
well.
Joe's cocktail bar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um I like that I can get mule free in a renovated goat barn and a Hefeweizen. It's
No, totally.
it's
I
pretty
dig it as
nice.
well. I
It's a
mean,
pretty nice, comfy part of the country.
yeah, no, I love the Finger
And
Lakes
I
and
have a lot of, I'm a real hometown booster.
totally. Yeah, I know you are, so I wanted to give you a chance to do so.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see what happens though.
Yeah.
Definitely before COVID, things felt a bit more popping. No, a lot of these smaller places are having labor problems, so we'll see how it all works out. But it does seem like there's a renewed interest amongst millennials in small town America versus suburban America,
Yeah, that's
which I would
interesting.
say are different. Well, it's like, the town I grew up in is like 10,000 people. It's surrounded on all sides by farms. To
Yeah.
me, this is like a small town, not a suburb.
Yeah.
Although at
Yeah.
the end of the day, you need to go to the Rochester Mall. You need to go to Victor to like go to the Apple store. It's still like it's only like 40 minutes,
Well,
which
it's kind of ideal in that regard. I think that's what people
which
love
is
with the
like
Finger Lakes. And
40
you know,
minutes is like not that much different than when I go to Glendale to get my
oh
iPhone
no,
fixed
not at
in
all.
LA.
There you go.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's like it's also not that far from the amenities you need in the suburbs, or the amenities you need in a nearby city.
Yeah.
Like when I left New York, I figured it out how I could get door to door from Williamsburg to my mom's house in Geneva, and I think I got it down
Yeah.
to 2 hours
Yeah. Oh wow.
flying. But
Yeah.
yeah, you got to take the early morning flight, and I lived in Williamsburg. So, early morning flight, no traffic on the BQE, go to LaGuardia, go through TSA pre, hop on the plane, 30 minutes, land, then either my sister will pick me up or I'll take an Uber home.
Yeah,
Takes about 40 minutes from the airport. So you could do it in 2 hours
it's
if
not bad.
you plan correctly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, it's within striking distance. All right, well, we can wrap pretty soon. I think we've been going
All
about
right.
2 hours. I did want to, I guess, as a last question, obviously last
Okay.
year was big in terms of the vibe shift, and this year you, I don't know if you say that you've had writer's block or if you're just kind of taking a step back.
No,
I shouldn't say that. Sorry, I can cut that if you want. But I did,
no,
this
it's
year's
okay.
been a
No,
little
no, no. I mean,
quieter. Yeah,
I think the same thing happened this year, which happened after Normcore went viral, which is
yeah,
that you get too much attention and you start to get in your head about you start thinking about the audience too much,
yeah.
which I think is bad.
Mhm.
But no, I'm working on something right now that's going to be kind of about my predictions about how AI is going to kind of kill social media.
Oh, okay.
and
Interesting.
and
Yeah,
also I think about you know the emergence of real life as the zone of luxury and
yeah. That feels like it's
the
happening.
digital
Yeah.
commons as being I forget who came up with this term. I think it was a former Gawker writer. The
Hmm.
inshitification of the internet, i.e.,
Yeah.
like all the kind of like big brands that millennials grew up with, digital brands that they loved, Apple and Twitter and Google. Increasingly, like I don't know, their products are kind of trash.
Yeah.
And the experience of using them feels like it's getting weirder and weirder, and it's probably because we're close to a tipping point,
Yeah.
um in which I think right now half of the internet activity is bots, but it
Yeah.
feels, my presumption is like we're really at the beginning of the capabilities of like chat GPT, etc.
Yeah.
And when it becomes cheaper and easier to just like let the bots interact with the bots online, I think we're going to see some really weird stuff start happening.
Yeah. That
Like I think
sounds
I already saw something from
sound.
MIT about how websites that generate all their content via chat GPT are like attracting um ad sales dollars. But
Hmm.
then you also have to wonder like, well, are the hits on the fake content coming from fake bots too?
Yeah,
You
no,
can
it's
kind
this
of
crazy
you can
thing. Yeah.
kind of imagine a digital economy where all different sides are kind of scamming each other.
Yeah.
Um, and I think just the volume of what that will enable might render a lot of the current digital infrastructure useless.
Yeah, seemingly. And perhaps for the better if it I don't know, not to be too polemical or something, or to spin all we've talked about in any one direction or the other, but I
It
would
just it
say
just
like anything that gets us out of doors more, and as you said, young people interacting, having fun is good, and maybe
well,
there's a
it just
scenario.
feels
Yeah,
like we're on a trajectory where um we're just going to replicate new, more digital models of the old culture industries we had before.
yeah.
Um, because they worked, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Like, I would say the big difference between, I don't know, 1998 and 2023 or something is that the culture industries were functional. Like, they turned profits. Clearly, not everyone got to participate. Duh, that's always the case.
yeah.
There's never going to be a version of culture that's not elitist.
Hmm.
But the industries themselves were like functional.
Yeah,
And they turned profits and they made stuff that people liked. And you just there's a real people have a real negativity around everything produced right now. And I think part of it is um businesses struggling to operationalize the internet to make a profit for them versus the platforms.
yeah,
So if AI kills all the platforms, I think it'll be good, and we'll probably just end up with like something that looks a lot like the past, but with more digital options. But also in which you have to straightforwardly pay for things again
yeah, yeah.
because all the free stuff is just going to be like a weird mix of like foreign
Bots
intelligence
and yeah.
psyops and like artificial intelligence and click farms in India, and we're close to that. So trying to imagine like what's it like if the economy of scale at AI means that you can push it to like 95% of the internet just being all random fake shit.
Mhm.
Um, then I think I don't know how these platforms really remain functional.
Yeah. Well, definitely we'll look forward to that. You'll post it through 8 Ball.
Yeah, I will. I will.
Great. All right. Well, unless you have anything else to plug, just thanks so much for coming on. You've been very
Yeah.
generous with your time and some great
Yeah. Great
perspectives and
chatting, Matt.
yeah,
All right.
excellent.
Have a
All
good
right.
weekend. Have a
You
happy
too.
Fourth.
Thanks. You
Bye.
as well. Talk soon.